He's going to have the issue, context, and transmission of a Tang Dynasty coin in 13th century Corinth. Mr. Chingyuan, his study in Beijing and also in the United States. He's fellow of main universities at our research, and he's working on the Macedonian dynasty also, and he's very interested about the common in Macedonia and Macedonian community and others. So I would like to welcome Mr. Chingyuan from Beijing. We are glad we have him with us also by connection, but we hope in another occasion to have the opportunity to be all together here in Greece. Mr. Chingyuan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I think there is a problem with the sharing option right now. For some reason, I was able to share my screen, but now after some maneuvers, I wasn't able to do so. Okay, now I can. All right, thank you for that introduction again. And I really appreciate the invitation to present my research here at this conference. So I will begin in the interest of time. In the summer of 2016, I had the opportunity to conduct research work at Corinth Archaeological Museum as part of the regular member experience of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. And as one would expect to do, would be expected to do, in fact, when in the coin room, is to browse through the reference section. Now, most, if not all, coin specimens found at Corinth would be represented in the entire reference collection, and one tray in particular housed coins from the Armenian, Abbasid, Seljuk, and Ottoman regimes, in addition to those pre-modern and modern nation states. These are a helpful reminder of the essential role that Corinth continued to play in the web of Eurasian interaction, despite religious confrontations, adverse geopolitical headwinds, and differences in ways of life. To the bottom left of this tray, an insignificant piece of metal with a hole in the middle is the Tang coin that we will be considering today. It has 4 Chinese characters on the obverse that reads Qianyuan Zhongbao. The first of its kind was issued during the Tang Dynasty in 758 CE, when the imperial court desperately injected liquidity into a tattered economy as the empire was turned upside down by a military insurrection. The coin's bewildering presence here at Corinth was to me intellectually captivating. I began a period of intense research that probably left an impression among friends at Corinth and the American school as a whole that I was entirely out of my mind. I submitted a report on the coin to the school in 2016 and later presented the coin at the annual conference of the Byzantine Studies Association of North America in 2018. The results of my research has been accepted for publication by the journal Hesperia, and which will likely appear in 2022 or 23. The journal editor has kindly provided the most recent cover in case I would like to speak about the publication. Now, I'm giving an account of my research process for 2 reasons. 1, I'm not trained as a numismatist, nor a sinologist or a medievalist, but an ancient historian of the Mediterranean world. My research on the Tang coin was out of pure personal interest on how 2 worlds may have been connected despite being so far apart. On the question of how the Tang coin reached Corinth, many among you expert scholars would be able to provide much more convincing theories than I have had in my article, and I think it is only right to acknowledge this. Now, there's another reason for the outline of my research process, and it is that there are 2 Song Dynasty coins discovered in Great Britain recently that I have not taken into account in my research. I only became aware of this fact when just this year, the previous Corinth excavations director, Guy Sanders, pointed me to Dr. Caitlin Green's blog, which not only shows a Xining Yuanbao found near Liverpool, but also included discussions of medieval sources that I did not know about. It is nice to know that there were indeed intercontinental visitors in the Mongol period, travelers who likely passed through Corinth from Beijing to Gascony in the 1280s. However, that passage in these itineraries may not be relevant to the Tang two Song Dynasty coins in particular. These two Song Dynasty coins were not found in archaeological context, and cautionary notes are attached to the profiles of these coins. And on another note, Dr. Helen Wang, expert of Chinese coins at the British Museum, was incisive in her comment that if there is no context or no other context, I'd suggest it's just a random coin find. Chinese coins were taken on ships from China to the Southeast Asia, South Asia to Middle East. So this coin could come that way at any date after 1008 or fallen out of a pocket not so long ago. Now, Dr. Green's blog post still remains valuable, and I encourage all to read it. But there is a difference between an archaeologically attested coin versus a stray find. But still, it is engaging to think about what's so special about finding Chinese cash coins in Europe. And the question can be phrased a little bit differently. Why are Chinese cash coin finds so rare in Europe? It is well known that gold and silver Roman and Byzantine coins have been found in Central and East Asia. And one of the guiding principles to interpreting these coins' mobility is the intrinsic value of the precious metal content. In other words, these coins hold value because they are gold and silver and could naturally be used as instruments of transaction. Another guiding principle to interpret numismatic mobility concerns images. One of the first scholars whom I contacted after completing the report in 2016 was Professor Lin Ying of Zhongshan University, as I found her discussion of Byzantine coins in China particularly informative at the time. She took note that coins found in China often show signs of piercing, indicating that they were once used as pendants or necklace or sewn onto clothing. Now, these guiding principles do not apply to this Tang coin found at Corinth. Hardly any currency value can be attached to such a small copper cash coin when it's removed from the fiduciary currency environment that created it. The imagery argument could work. Chinese characters could have been appealing to some, leading to the conversion of this Tang coin into an heirloom. But this interpretation would still only be part of a series of truly serendipitous conditions to take the Tang coin to Corinth. Again, I wish not to elaborate on hypotheticals today. What I want to do is to focus on the Tang coin's archaeological context and the archaeologists who preserved and identified it. It is the archaeological context that frames the possibilities for the interpretation of the Tang coin's transmission. And I state up front and out of sequence from my presentation with this slide here, that this coin was most likely found in secondary deposition. The final location of the Tang coin was likely once or twice removed from where it was originally deposited. It could have been a burial, a coin hoard, or a room. The question of the coin's transmission has to be set, therefore, within a 500-year time frame, from the coin's first issuance in the mid to late 7th century to its final deposition. To itemize all possibilities based on known historical events or individual travelers' itinerary can be productive to a certain extent, but to think in the aggregate terms may be more constructive. On the immediate archaeological context, I wish first to acknowledge the late Dr. Theodora Stilwell McKay, who found the Tang coin during the 1960 campaign in what is now known as the Frankish area of Corinth. She was a regular member of the American School at the time, and her work on Byzantine and Frankish period pottery remains consequential today. I also wish to acknowledge Dr. Nancy Boukidis, the Assistant Director Emerita of the Corinth excavations. She is the scholar who made sure that this insignificant coin will not go unnoticed. She identified the Tang coin as a Qianyuan Zhongbao in the 1970s. It must have involved a considerable amount of work and resolve, along with an admirable sense of respect for cultures beyond the Mediterranean world. Here, I wish to express my sincere thanks for her dedicated and honorable approach to archaeology and to cultures across the world. I also thank Director Guy Sanders, Associate Director Yunia Tsuno, the current Director Christopher Pfaff, and numismatist Orestes Zervos of the Corinth excavations for their continued emphasis on the excavation and preservation of evidence of all cultures, and for encouraging and empowering scholars to study them comprehensively. Now I will turn to the question of relative chronology and the find spot of the Tang coin. Tang coin was found in an ash and charcoal layer filled with tiles and ceramic fragments with stylistic features primarily from both the Byzantine and Frankish periods. The ash layer crossed two different trenches, one supervised by Dr. Stillwell McKay, the other by Ron Stroud, now a renowned classicist. In the interest of time, I focus only on finds of the so-called room CC reported in Dr. Stillwell McKay's excavation notebook, as they have immediate association with the Tang coin. The latest coin from CC is the so-called petty coppers associated with Willem de Villehardouin, the third of the Villehardouins to rule the Morea. Willem de Villehardouin is better known for a later Bill and Clarenza issue, generally accepted as issued between 1249 to 1289. And this particular one, the Corinthum type we have here, is harder to date. These types of verse legends present the name of the princeps in abbreviation G, followed by P, princeps, in Achaia, but any of the first three princes of Frankish Achaia, namely Geoffrey I, Geoffrey II, and Willem himself, could have been the issuing authority. The same difficulties can be said of the Latin imitative trachi found in CC. This type A small module has the reverse showing a full-length figure of an emperor wearing stemma, Divitician, and chlamys, holding in his right hand a labarum on a long shaft, and in his left hand an annex kakia. It is a concave coin struck in imitation of the larger Latin imitative type A Constantinopolitan module, which was itself an imitation of coins struck during the reign of Manuel I. Strikingly, among the 93 Latin imitative coins found during the 1989 and the 1997 campaigns at Corinth, 91, almost all of them, are associated with archaeological assemblages before 1219. Hence, an early date is preferable, perhaps. Now, while the two latest coins in CC suggest that the ash layer was formed in the early 13th century, it is important to note that coins tend to be more useful as a chronological reference if applied conservatively to establish a terminus antequem as opposed to a terminus postquem of a feature or horizon. The reason is that coins are commonly in circulation for much longer than their dates of issuance. Conservatively, the presence of a Villehardouin coin suggests that the ash and charcoal layer was likely of 13th century date, but how far into the 13th century is uncertain. Since even the dates of issuance for the two Frankish period coins are uncertain, I used the ceramic fragments from the ash and charcoal layer to establish a second set of chronological reference data. My study of the ceramic fragments from the ash and charcoal layer was made possible with the generous guidance of Dr. Rosanna Valente and Director Guy Sanders. I also find Dr. Sanders's synchronization of Frankish pottery and coin hoards useful to ascertain the relative chronology of the ash and charcoal layer. While coins may be in circulation much longer than the last date of its issuance, pottery tends to be discarded immediately following damage or destruction, hence more reflective of the period of its immediate use. It is therefore important to take into account the ceramic finds to establish a relative chronology. So I compared the ash layer's ceramic finds with Dr. Sanders's synchronized hoard and ceramic evidence of the Frankish period, yielding the following results. The row highlighted in yellow are ceramic types found both in the ash layer and in Dr. Sanders's reference assemblages. Of note is a very small amount of protomaiolica, which suggests a terminus post-quem towards the end of the 13th century, but this presence may be attributed to intrusion. More reservedly, better represented slip-painted ware and glaze-painted ware fragments from the ash layer suggest a date in the third quarter of the 13th century. Archival data also helps with locating the fine spot of the ash and charcoal layer, which spread across a walled area of late Byzantine to early Frankish stage. Then a late Frankish period wall was sunk and cut the ash layer into half. Now, the location of this wall is a bit difficult to ascertain. The area was filled up upon the conclusion of the season, and while excavations in the 1970s revisited the same area, a new grid and excavation system, along with the filling and re-excavation process, likely disturbed the remains considerably. The necessary simplification of published state plans also made it difficult to ascertain the specific location of the ash layer. Nevertheless, it is still possible to triangulate the fine spots of the coin using archival information. And now one can say with relative confidence that the Tang coin was found south or even underneath a large late 13th century Frankish hall, east of Unit 1 and north of Unit 7 in the so-called Frankish area. The destruction of Byzantine buildings during the Frankish takeover of Corinth in the early 13th century likely generated destruction debris that remained untended and further mixed with occupation deposits accumulated between 1050 to 1250 CE, when Latin refugees arrived following the retaking of Constantinople in 1261 by Alexios Strategopoulos. This event likely prompted a systematic cleanup of the area around the Frankish hall for the erection of living quarters to accommodate the influx of refugees. In other words, the Tang coin could have arrived any time before the third quarter of the 13th century. And this complicates two already vexing questions concerning the Tang coin's process of transmission. As mentioned earlier, the process likely involved a series of serendipitous events, perhaps so mundane as to not even worth taking note by the actors themselves who were engaged in the transfer and exchange of this coin. Now, I did try to focus on where the coin was likely produced in my article submitted to Hesperia in order to set at least some limitations on the possible scenarios of westward transmission. And in the interest of time, I summarize my results as the following. First, the coin was likely produced by or in the domain of the Anxi Protectorate, roughly equivalent to China's Xinjiang Autonomous Region in modern day speak. There is a possibility that it was produced in the Chui Valley region in modern Kyrgyzstan. Second, from the mid-8th century CE onwards, the Central Asian geopolitical environment underwent a significant shift as the Tang Empire retreated and the Abbasid Empire became increasingly dominant in terms of cultural expressions and norms of commercial transactions. Tang currency seemed to have phased out by the early 9th century, even in the Chui Valley, where the Corinth Tang coin may have been produced. Some possibilities can be entertained, but the overall currency environment was adverse to the transmission of the Corinth coin as an instrument for transactions. Third, Chinese coin hoards are occasionally reported from excavations in the Greater Indian Ocean region, and it is likely that such finds were associated with the growing interest in using Chinese bronze cash currencies of all dynasties for trading purposes in Southeast Asia, particularly from the 11th century onwards. Fourth, there still needs to be the final step in both networks that actually bring the coin into Corinth. And a Jewish merchant based in Cairo could, in theory, achieve this, as the Cairo Geniza papers suggest. The fact that Corinth indeed had a Jewish community a generation before the Villehardouin takeover is also suggestive, though not certain, and certain indication for such a possibility. Now, none of these scenarios are by themselves an accurate a representation of how the coin actually got to Corinth, but the ensemble of all possibilities must be one of the primary means of understanding intercontinental movements of such inconspicuous small objects. To conclude, the Tang coin's arrival likely involved persons operating at the peripheries of monetary systems of the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, who either chose to demonetize the Tang coin and convert it into a symbolic, exotic, or even sentimental item, or accepting it as one outright. Its arrival at Corinth would have also depended upon persons, same or otherwise, to bring the coin personally sometime before the third quarter of the 13th century into Corinth. Under any such circumstances, the Tang coin could have arrived, having already been fully converted into a symbolic item. I conclude my presentation today. Thank you.
I would like to thank you, Mr. Chingyuan. He improved us that how important is not only the excavation of the first reading, but the second reading and the unity of the historic place. So I would like to give the floor to Vice Rector of the Ionian University, Professor Ilias Giarenis. Mr. Giarenis is very common, his works for us, and especially for the Byzantine period. And the title of his announcement is Byzantium and Eurasia in the 13th century, aspects of contact and dialogue. Mr. Giarenis.
Thank you. Dear President of the Hellenic Institute of Byzantine and Post-Byzantine Studies, dear President of the Supervisory Committee of the Hellenic Institute of Byzantine and Post-Byzantine Studies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, Kali Kyriaki. The 13th century gave Byzantium some unprecedented experiences. Its first years saw the Latin conquest of the reigning city and the disintegration of the Byzantine Empire as a result of the Fourth Crusade. After 1204, many inhabitants of Constantinople had to move in search of maintaining some free political life. Many of them chose to move eastwards to the new empires of Nicaea and Trebizond, which emerged as authentic heirs of the ecumenical Byzantine legacy, alongside the state of Epirus, which lay in the western parts. The geographical dimension of the states of Trebizond and Nicaea gave their existence an important oriental or eastern character, which was made manifest as an attempt for a mixture of the traditional Byzantine identity with reinventions of labels, reinterpretations of the ecumenical imperial past for addressing new needs and demands, but also for dealing with their eastern neighbors, especially Georgians in the case of Trebizond and Seljuk Turks as far as Nicaea was concerned. In my paper, I will try to show how far that interaction with the East went for Nicaea, and in which way that affected aspects of politics, diplomacy, and culture in the re-established Byzantine state after 1261. I would like to point out that the realities of the time also present an interesting geographical dimension. Regarding the so-called Empire of Nicaea, one should always bear in mind that this very successor state was gradually formed and established in Northwest Asia Minor, having started from point zero. It was first able to secure lands exclusively in Asia Minor, and only from the third decade of the 13th century onwards, under Ioannis Doukas Vatazis, it started to gain lands also in Europe, thus further significantly expanding its territory. In the background of our discussion lies the notion of the West through the looking glass of Nicaea. Not surprisingly, that did not exactly coincide with the traditional Byzantine ideology, since the whole political scene had now dramatically changed. The Byzantine Empire had practically come to an end, its ecumenical character had been decidedly lost, and the effort made at Nicaea was originally aimed at the establishment of a state that would act as a shelter for people who would not reconcile themselves with the situation of the Latin occupation in its political or ecclesiastical aspects. The exiled Nicaean state gradually devised plans for the reconquest of the Latin-occupied lands and the liberation, as rhetoric effectively put it, of the Byzantine population who lived under Latin rule. But the empire primarily had to struggle for its very existence, which was neither an obvious outcome nor an easy task. What is often underestimated is that the Nicaean state had been established to the east. In fact, it occupied only the eastern part of the former empire. Its emperor steadily used the title Basileus Romeon and claimed the traditional imperial status. But there were some political and ecclesiastical officials of the time who seem to have preferred to call its first emperor especially, whose lands were exclusively Asian, Emperor of the East, της Ανατολής. The emperors of Nicaea had to secure their political survival first in Asia Minor, and thus they often resorted to diplomatic connections or military confrontations with other states in the East, such as the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, the Kingdom of Armenia, and the Empire of Trebizond. How far did it go, geographically speaking, and in which way that important eastern dimension of the state of Nicaea paved the road for contact and dialogue? Sometimes ironically, in ironic dimension, this contact and dialogue, as we shall see. How did the Byzantine emperors at Nicaea and Constantinople use the Eurasian evolutions in order to devise geostrategical plans or make use of what was seen as an opportunity? As is well known, the 13th century saw the great Mongol conquests. China, Europe, and Islam had to suffer. In the Byzantine sources, Mongols are mostly named as Mughuli, Skythe, Tatari, and Tokhari. In the next 15 minutes, I'll try to show how Byzantium dealt with them, with the Mongols, before and after 1216, in terms of diplomacy and preparation for war. How Byzantine imperial power tried to make some profit out of the menace of the Mongols presented to the states of the era, and how this policy was an integral part of the overall Byzantine strategy before and after 1261. Since there is a much clearer view of the Paleologian years, I'll try to give some more space and time to the evolution before the reconquest of 1261. In 1231, a peace between the Empire of Nicaea and the Seljuks of Rum was concluded. The reason lay to the presence and threat of the Mongols. The Seljuk Sultan Kaikubad had an urgent need to direct his forces in the eastern Anatolian plateau against them, and that framework gave Ioannis III an opportunity to focus his efforts to the west, and especially to the raison d'etre of his state and rulership, thus the reconquest of Constantinople. The Mongol threat was seen as affording the Byzantine ruler a golden opportunity. An overwhelming Mongol offensive across the steppe in the late 1230s brought about consequences for the Byzantines of Nicaea. A force of several Cumans broke off from the westward flight of their fellows into the Hungarian plain. It chose to turn south into the Balkans with their wives and children in 1237 or 38, as Nikephoros Grigoras tells us. They subsequently penetrated into Byzantine Thrace to the south, extensively pillaging the countryside. The Mongols, whom Gregoras calls Hyperborean Scyths, by 1240 preoccupied every ruler in the Eastern Mediterranean, Balkans, and Central Europe. They consequently could not be ignored by the grand strategy, which was designed and unfolded in the Empire of Nicaea. The military steps of the Mongols and the successes they had over states of the period, which were border neighbors with that state in exile, were carefully scrutinized and taken into account as a starting point for diplomatic or military moves, especially by Ioannis III Vatatzes. From 1237, Vatatzes was sending auxiliaries to stiffen the resolve of the Seljuks in Rome in the face of the renewed westerly and southerly Mongol expansion. The new Mongol menace to Asia Minor, which was posed by Kormagun's forces, drew Byzantines and Cilician Armenians closer. In 1239-1240, ecclesiastical negotiations were renewed to settle the traditional dogmatic dispute between their churches in the search of a unity in the face of a common threat. Vatatzes' gaze seems to be constant upon the Mongol forces, converging on his domains, and he did everything he could to rebuild walls and castles. He must have also felt somehow safer because of the buffers which existed between his territory and the Mongols in both the Balkans, that is Serbia, Hungary, and especially Bulgaria, and Asia Minor, that is Cilician Armenia, Trebizond, and especially Seljuk Rum. Vatatzes made every effort through a combination of intelligence and diplomacy to gain information on the Mongol steps and plans. He extensively used this valuable information to schedule, reschedule, or change his own plans regarding the important region of Macedonia and Thrace and the Balkans in the wider perspective, without neglecting the crucial Anatolian core of his empire. Both the Balkans and Western Anatolia suffered because of a massive Mongol stroke in 1241, but when the situation seemed to be really threatening for the Empire of Nicaea, there were sudden turns which brought Batu back in Karakorum. In the following year, the Mongols unexpectedly and dramatically came back to Eastern Asia Minor in force and threatened the Seljuks and the Empire of Nicaea. In the face of that menace, the entente between the two parts was reaffirmed. Vatatzes had interpreted that menace as a starting point for war preparations and improvement of the respective infrastructure. His officials were constructing a great number of fortifications along the frontier facing the east and stockpiling all the necessary provisions in various strong points of the empire. Opportunism was there in many ways. The Byzantines were also making great profits by selling provisions at high prices to the Turkish refugees from Eastern Asia Minor, which the Mongols had ravaged. After the accession of Minqi, the Empire of Nicaea was only one of the parts which sought friendly relations with the Mongols. In the famous account of William of Rubruck, emissary of St. Louis IX to Minqi's court at Karakorum, from December 1253 to June 1254, we learned that sometime earlier, a Saracen had been dispatched by Minqi as the Mongol ambassador to the court of Vatatzes, a fact which gave the Byzantine emperor concern that it might be a first step for a future Mongol attack on Byzantium. Because of that fear, Vatatzes gave expensive gifts to the ambassador, that's a really Byzantine practice, and dispatched Byzantine envoys back to Karakorum to earn some time and to collect any information that could prove of some use. The report was that no such attack was being planned. Vatatzes now felt safer and decided that it was the right time to unfold his action regarding the Balkans. In 1254, Minqi appointed his younger brother, Hulegu, as Ilkhan for the Near East to resume Mongol expansion into the Levant. There were strong rumors that he had plans to invade too many states, including Nicaea. Vatatzes ambassadors were present at the court of Minqi when William of Rubruck arrived there in late December of 1253. These ambassadors must have also heard such rumors. Later in 1254, a second delegation arrived at Vatatzes' court, most probably at Nymphaeum. The head of the delegation carried the Mongol gold paisa, that is the mark that he was fully accredited by the Khagan to speak in his name. Such an official character of the emissary might well have been interpreted as a sign of danger, possibly presaging an offensive military operation against Byzantium. Vatatzes thus made a bold move. He delayed the ambassador from keeping his way to the Pope as he intended to do. The pretext Vatatzes used was that the ambassador's guide, a certain Theodolus, did not bear the necessary document which would prove that he had been authorized by the Pope to act on his behalf. When the chief Mongol emissary died at Nymphaeum, it's an accident, I guess, Vatatzes entrusted the paisa to the other members of the delegation, whom he dispatched back to the Khagan, thus negating the mission. At that highly critical point, Vatatzes died on the 3rd of November of 1254 at Nymphaeum. From the very beginning of his reign, the new emperor Theodoros II Laskaris had to deal with a new high-level Mongol delegation which arrived in his territory, giving much concern to both the emperor and his subjects. Theodoros saw the new delegation as an outcome of his father's bold move regarding the previous one that we mentioned. His expectation for something bad to come somehow explains why he took some bold and quite unusual steps regarding the delegation. He instructed that the Mongol envoys were to be guided from the frontier to Lydia through a rough Byzantine territory. Once the envoys arrived in Nymphaeum or in nearby Magnesia, they were received at court with full pomp and the Byzantine army arrayed on parade to impress them with the emperor's resolve. Pachymeres tells us that Theodoros' aim was to inspire fear in the visitors. After the Mongol envoys departed, Theodoros went to Philadelphia to inspect that bastion of eastern frontier defenses and also to gather any intelligence he could from his friends at the Seljuk court. In the fall of 1256, Seljuks were disastrously defeated by the Mongols near Aksaray. When Theodoros learned the news, he collected up virtually the entire Byzantine field army in the Balkans and rushed back to Asia Minor. In early 1257, he resuscitated the Byzantine Seljuk coalition as a bulwark against the Mongols again. But fortunately for both Byzantium and Seljuk Rome, Hulagu's attentions were absorbed outside of Anatolia by 1257. In August of 1258, Theodoros II was dead and his dynasty was soon displaced in the Imperium by its most talented general, Michael Paleologus. Shortly afterwards, Byzantium and Rome experienced a windfall when the Egyptian Mamluks defeated the residue of the Mongol army in the Near East in 1260, and this was very important for what was to come. Meanwhile, Berke, Batu's second successor as Khan of the Golden Horde, converted to Islam and formed a pan-Islamic alliance with the Egyptian Mamluks against the anti-Islamic Persian Ilkhanids, thereby irrevocably breaking Mongol solidarity. As has been pointed out, the crucial communications link between Berke and Baybars, the Mamluk Sultan, was to be Constantinople, newly restored in 1261. Michael Paleologus thereafter artfully served as the desired middleman, while also, in the best Byzantine diplomacy tradition, simultaneously maintaining friendly relations with Ilkhanids. From the evidence of Pachymeres and others, some 15 subsequent Byzantine embassies to Egypt in the period from 1285 to 1328 can be counted to nurture the ancient Mamluk, Yehid, and Byzantine axis. In circa 1270, Michael Paleologus gave to the great Mongol Noyan of the Golden Horde his purportedly bastard daughter, Ephrosyne. But his need for good relations with the Ilkhanids had even earlier urged him to make an alliance with them in 1260, and to seal that alliance by dispatching another purportedly bastard daughter of his, Mary, to Tabriz in late 1264. There she married to Hulegu's son, Abaka, much beloved in her adopted homeland. She did great service for Byzantium there. When she returned to Constantinople after her husband's death in 1282, she became a nun and adorned a little foundation above the fanar, which to this day bears her name. She was also to prove a valuable diplomat in the Byzantine service in negotiations with the Ilkhanids at Nicaea in 1305. If Lippard has opted for the existence of a bride's school at Lakerne, where Paleologian Byzantine brides for the East were educated and prepared, there can be much doubt for the alleged kinship of many of these brides, either labeled as Paleologina, Diplovatagena, and so on. Please, let me conclude with some remarks which could perhaps give a broader framework regarding Byzantium in Eurasia in the period we examined. The Empire of Nicaea, which started its existence with a purely Asian core, had to follow more closely the geostrategical movements in Eurasia, especially in the menace of the Mongols. But the threat for the empire seems to have been mostly less immediate than the one posed to other states of the era. Ioannis Vatadzis, skillfully and boldly, made use and tried to make profit of the Mongol expeditions in the Balkans and in Asia Minor to strengthen diplomatical relations or to enlarge his territory. But that bold strategy was followed by a serious concern regarding the menace Mongols could pose for his own state too. The fact that such an evolution was never fulfilled is, to my opinion, due not only to the buffer states we mentioned before, but also to a concern that the Mongols also had on the basis of both Vatadzis' skillfulness and the respect that the Byzantine Empire as a legacy and as a brand name triggered. After 1261, Michael Paleologus was able to play a more central role in Eurasian politics as a middleman, taking advantage of the rift in Mongol solidarity, making use of Constantinople's symbolic importance, and creating a practice of producing and sending women from noble families of the capital, especially called or labeled Paleologine, as brides to the East. Brides in the service of the empire. Thank you for your attention.
I would like to thank you, Mr. Giarenis, and it's very important to have this period of dialogues, embassies, and all the others community with the Mongols. And now we finish this session with Ms. Lijuan, She is assistant professor at Peking University, Beijing. He has held a PhD at the Minqi University, and she's going to have a speech on preliminary notes of the Syriac version of the legend of St. George found in Turfan. This is very important because now we are going to see how the community of Turfan has life, and I would like to ask to listen this announcement with a lot of interest. Ms. Lijuan, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. And I would like to express my sincere thankfulness to all the organizers of this conference. And it's my real pleasure to have the opportunity to present my recent research here. So my talk today concerns the Syriac version of the legend of St. George found in Turfan. First, please let me briefly introduce the discovery of the Syriac fragments at Turfan. At the very beginning of last century, 4 German expeditions to Turfan were conducted. And in these expeditions, especially in the second and third expeditions, many Syriac fragments were found at the monastery site of Shuipang, near Blaik, north of Turfan. I'm sorry. Can you see my screen? So I try to share my screen again. I hope it is successful. Then I will continue. If it's all right.
Yes, you can continue.
Okay. So there are many Syriac fragments were found at the Christian monastery site of Shuipang, near Blaik, north of Turfan. As we know, Turfan is an oasis located approximately 150 kilometers southeast of Urumqi, now in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in western China. And on the map, you can see in the red part. So Albert von Lecoq, the leader of the second German Turfan expedition, discussed the Blaik finds as follows. Er, namely Theodor Batus, an assistant of von Lecoq, hat in dem schaulich zerstörten Gemäuer eine fabelhafte Ausbeute christlicher Handschriften ausgegraben. He excavated in the extremely ruined walls a marvelous booty of Christian manuscripts. There are in total approximately 450 Syriac fragments, and they have dated between 9th to 13th centuries, corresponding to the period of Uyghur Kingdom of Kocho. As is well known, Syriac was a principal liturgical language of the Church of the East, which is also the first Christian church which brought Christianity to China. But most of the Syriac fragments found in Turfan are liturgical texts. We also find a few other genres of texts. For example, the philosophical text of Aristotle, his categories, and the medical text, which includes parallels from Hippocrates and Galen. And there are also a few hagiographical texts. One of them is the Legend of St. George, preserved in 8 Syriac fragments found in Turfan. As we know, the Legend of St. George is one of the most renowned hagiographies in the West, and it seems that this text also enjoys great popularity in the Turfan oasis during the Uyghur Kingdom of Kocho. Different versions of the legend, both in Syriac and in its Sogdian and Uyghur translations, were found at Shuipang. My talk today concerns the Syriac version of the legend of St. George, and I shall provide a few preliminary notes on the Syriac fragments found in Turfan, especially the two fragments concerning the first round of tortures St. George suffered and the conversion of the general Anatolius. Especially, I shall demonstrate that the Turfan version actually contains more elements of the original Greek text than the Textus Receptus, namely the transmitted Syriac version, and that it records the earliest Syriac translation by far of the legend. So this is the picture of the fragments, and this picture shows 7 of them. And this is the 8th one, which is also the best preserved folio. So let me first introduce earlier researches concerning the fragments. In his 1991 article, Eine unbekannte Version der Georgios-Legende aus Turfan, Miklot Marov identified 6 Syriac fragments from Turfan as part of an unknown Syriac version of the legend of St. George. As Malot demonstrated in his article, this version exhibits remarkable differences from the Textus Receptus of the legend and is thus of special importance for our understanding of the transmission history of the text. In the groundbreaking catalog published in 2014, Erica Hunter and Mark Dickens furthermore pointed out that 2 other small fragments, namely 359 and 381, belong to the same manuscript, and that 381 and 365 fit together. However, the authors also reported that due to the fragmentary state of the Syriac fragment 359, it remains unclear how it relates to other fragments. So the small one above is 359, and the larger one is another fragment, 360. The picture shows the fragments on both sides, the hector and vessel. So earlier research reported that it remains unclear how the small one relates to other fragments. So in my research, I have solved this problem, and I have demonstrated that the small fragment, 359, actually fits the upper part of 360 perfectly. On the other hand, as can be seen from the picture, there are also small pieces contained in this folio, which seem to have been mislocated. The 2 small pieces are marked by number 1 and number 2, and they are now relocated in their original places. By relocating the 2 small pieces and fragment 359, we now have a more complete picture of the original folio, which allows us to have a better understanding of the whole text. So now for the convenience of discussion, let me briefly introduce the related materials. As we know, the legend of St. George enjoyed great popularity, both in the West and in the East, and the text has many translations and paraphrases in different traditions. In my research, I mainly use the following versions. First, the transmitted Syriac version, which has been edited by Beijing and Brooks. And for the Greek versions, including a series of manuscripts, I rely on mainly Kumbach's edition. And for the Latin version, ex Latine, I use the edition of Halbrichs. And for the Armenian version, I rely on the Latin translation by Peters. And for the Coptic and Ethiopic versions, I rely basically on Bach's English translation. So let us return to our topic, and I shall demonstrate how the Turfan Syriac fragments contains more elements of the original Greek text than the transmitted one. My first example is a passage contained in the Syriac fragment 360, lines 11 to 23 on the vessel side. In this passage, 2 tortures St. George suffered are mentioned, namely an iron hammer and a heavy stone pillar. On the fragment, it is written thus. The And thereafter, again, the wicked ordered that he should go to the prison and they should make for him a hammer of iron. With it, they should beat him until his brain will pour out from his nose. His flesh will be torn up and will be full of blood. This is the first torture. And then thereafter, he ordered that the blessed one should be closed in the prison, his sides with 4 holes, and as they stretch the Holy One, they should bring a part of pillar, stole, of stone. So far could 10 servants, the number is 10 servants could row, and they should put on him. So this is the 2 tortures written in the fragments found in Turfan. But surprisingly, these 2 tortures cannot be found in the transmitted Syriac version of the legend, but they are actually attested in a series of earlier versions of the legend. For example, for the first torture, iron hammer, we find Psellos in the Latin version, and there is a similar description of the iron hammer and with details of the brain from nose. And the similar case exists also in the Ethiopic version, the iron hammer and with a rod of iron till his brains protruded through his nose. And concerning the stone pillar, we find a series of Psellos in the following versions. For example, in the Paris version, Liton Panagiotopoulos, and in Wien, Liton Panagiotopoulos, and the number of the men who rode the pillar is 4. And in the ex-Latin version, there is also a part of the patem columnae, and the number of the there are also mentioned the number of the people is also mentioned. And in the Armenian version, we can see a similar description about the huge and heavy stone. And in the Coptic version, part of a stone pillar and 8 men rode it. In the Ethiopic version, the captain of the pillar and 8 men lifted it up. So there is basically no real difference between these versions, although the number of the men who rode the pillar often varies. So the 2 tortures as described in the Turfan fragments thus find a series of Psellos in various texts in other traditions, including the Greek tradition. They belong to the so-called the first round of tortures St. George suffered before his forced death on the wheel. But these 2 tortures cannot be found in the transmitted Syriac version. Why? This phenomenon can only be explained if we regard the Turfan version as a much earlier version than the transmitted one. As a renowned scholar Brooks already points out, in the transmitted Syriac version, the incidents are omitted in a manner similar to that of the later Greek texts, since they both omit those parts of the legend which were most likely to cause offense, and especially the long series of impossible tortures because of their wide improbability. In this context, it is remarkable to find that the impossible tortures are well preserved and even fully developed in the Turfan version. This can only be explained if we regard it as an early version in which the abridgments had not yet been made. Another good example can be found in the fragment 362. Here we find a brief description of the conversion of the general Anatolius. After the first death of St. George, a general called Anatolius converted to the Christian belief. Besides, there are also 1,099 soldiers and 1 woman also converted to Christianity. So here it is written, the Scatus saw that the blessed George was revived and rose from the grave. He believed God and his whole army. And here the general's name is Anatolius. And those who believed with Anatolius were 1,099 and 1 woman. A different version is found in the transmitted Syriac text, in which the general is called Anatoninus. And it is also said that his whole troop converted taxes, but the number is not mentioned. So which one is an earlier one? As we shall see, the Turfan version again finds a series of parallels in various traditions, especially the earlier Greek versions. In the Athene version, Anatolius holds Statilatus, and the number of the people who converted is 3,099 and 1 woman. And in the Veneziana version in Venice, it is also said Anatolius holds Statilatus, and the number is 395. In the Coptic version, again, Anatolius, not Anatoninus, and the number is 3,009 and 1 woman. And there is also a variant reading 3,999. And in the Ethiopic version, Anatolius and 4,900 souls. As we can see from the text in most of the Greek old folk books and in the Oriental tradition, especially in the Coptic, Ethiopic, and Armenian recensions, the name of the general is Anatolius. And similar to the Turfan version, they also record the number of the converted people, although the number is unstable in different versions. This example adds to our evidence that the Turfan Syriac version contains more details from in the earlier Greek versions of the legend, and it's thus much earlier than the transmitted Syriac version. In a word, all the evidence suggests that our fragments preserve an earlier version of the legend, which is much closer to the original text than the transmitted version, although it is rather the latter which has been preserved in a number of manuscripts, the earliest one dating to 7th century, and which enjoyed great popularity in later periods. The Turfan version is very probably not, as Malot supposed, the second translation on the basis of a later Greek version, but in fact, it preserves more incidents from the original. Generally speaking, as an otherwise unattested version which contains more original elements, the Turfan Syriac version of the legend adds to our knowledge of the transmission history of the legend and shows that the text has been transmitted in a much more complicated way than we earlier thought. In particular, it is surprising to discover that the Syriac Christians had already brought this valuable manuscript to Central Asia and to what today is China during the Uyghur Kingdom of Kotor. And it is on the basis of this version of the legend that the Sogdian Uyghur versions were gradually developed, and there is even a Middle Chinese version of the legend. So in recent years, a Chinese incantation of St. George called Ji Si Zhou has been discovered in the so-called Xiapu Wenshu, the ritual manuscripts of Manichaeism in Xiapu County, Fujian Province, South China. This indicates that the legend of St. George was not only well received in the Uyghur Kingdom of Kotor, but had also been introduced into South China and even absorbed into other folk religions at an early date. So all these versions, including the Syriac, Sogdian, Uyghur, and the Middle Chinese versions, bear witness to the great popularity the legend enjoyed in the Turfan oasis. So this is my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. It's a pity that we don't have these colleagues with us, and also it's an opportunity to have the community and the communication through the new media. And I would like to begin if you have any questions about the first announcement of Mr. Chingyuan. We don't have any questions for Professor Chingyuan. So if you have...
Sorry, yeah, I'm here.
Okay. He's online, but we don't have any question for you.
Okay, good.
Yeah, Professor, thank you. So we shall go now to the second announcement of Mr. Giarenis. Do you have any question for Mr. Giarenis? Yes.
Professor Giarenis, thank you for this all-inclusive, very informed approach of Nicene policy towards the Mongols. I was just listening to what you said about the role Constantinople played between communication for the communication between the Golden Horde and the Mamluks. I was wondering if you have any idea of what Venice or Genoa, I mean the sea power during that period, were doing. Were they in favor of this direct contact between the Golden Horde and the Mamluk? If you are familiar with what the Venetians and Genoese were asking, what we're looking for.
Thank you. You mean in which period? In the Paleologian period?
In the 1260s, around that period, like you said, which is the period in which Constantinople acted as the liaison between the Golden Horde and the Mamluk state in Egypt. So, yeah.
Paleologos tries to play a central role, of course, more central than it was before 1261. With different, the situation has changed. I believe that this is not very, that the West is not so happy with these attempts. And also in this perspective, because we have many evidence which shows that Constantinople tries to regain a role that the West does not want it to have anymore. I mean, they believe that the Byzantine Empire does not exist anymore. Michael Paleologos has a grand strategy which does not really comply with this. He tries very hard to implement it in many ways during his reign, and this is not so, they're not really happy with this. That's what I believe, but I have not seen it in this perspective. I'll do that. Thank you.
Any other question for Professor Giarenis?
Thank you so much for this rich and detailed paper. I've got a question concerning this idea, which has been expressed, I think, by Delobet some years ago about the revolutionary idea of Theodore to forget Constantinople, oublier Constantinople, I think, and the idea to recenter in a definitive way the empire in the East. So I wanted to ask, first of all, what you think of this idea. In your opinion, was this actually a perspective for Theodore to forget Constantinople and recenter to the East? And then do you think that the grand strategy of Vatatzes, after all, which you have shown so clearly, influenced this development, if you agree with the existence of it? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't really believe that in Nicaea there was ever this idea as a dominant one. I believe that they tried to make some ideological schemes about regaining Constantinople and liberating all these people from the Latin domination. So I don't think this is the main ideological scheme in Nicaea. I would say, on the contrary, that this is for many years the raison d'être of the state to conquer Constantinople. But as they are in the East. That's what I tried to show, that the geographical dimension is somehow, we somehow ignore it. They are somehow in the East, and they have to deal with these things, and they have to follow much closer, and they do so. What happens in the East? They try to make a diplomacy for the West and for the East, which is somehow different. I mean, they do different schemes for the East and the West. Theodoros II is a philosopher king, and of course he makes some philosophical thoughts on that, but I don't believe that it is the main ideological scheme of Nicaea, and that's why I believe that Michael Palaiologos tried to continue this legacy. And the grand strategy by Michael Palaiologos is a continuation of the grand strategy by Vatazes, which was somehow forgotten by Theodoros II. In a simplistic way, I'm trying to give this thing, but I believe that Ioannis Vatazes is a very, very important Byzantine emperor who has made a whole grand strategy where opportunism is a real important part of that strategy. He tries to see where the opportunity is and to make profit of it.
Any other question? No. So for the last of the speakers, any question for Professor Lijuan? We don't have any questions. So, oh, you have, yes, yes. Professor Lijuan.
Hello. Hello.
Yes.
Online. She's
Yes.
online. Okay.
No, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. And I was very interested that you talked about the legend of St. George in Turfan as being older than the Textus Receptus. You also mentioned that the Receptus seems to be linked with later Greek versions as well. Is the Receptus a retranslation of the Greek of the later version? And if so, when would that have happened?
Thank you for your question. Yes, the Syriac, the transmitted Syriac version is a translation of the Greek text, and probably a later Greek text. I think, yes, since the earliest transmitted Syriac manuscript is dated to 7th century, so it can be only the possible period can be only might be 7th century, and the Turfan version, since it preserves more elements of the original Greek text, the earlier Greek text, I suppose the translation, the time of translation should be earlier than 7th century, at least. Yeah. Thank you.
Any other question? We don't have any other question. Thank you very much. We are going to have the next session in 10 minutes, 12 o'clock. Okay? Thank you.
sunshine. Everybody loves the sunshine. The sunshine. Everybody loves the sunshine. Sunshine. Folks get down in the sunshine. Sunshine, yeah. Folks get brown in the sunshine. Just bees and things and flowers. 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 My life, my life, my life, my life in the sunshine. Everybody loves the sunshine. Sunshine. Everybody loves the sunshine. Sunshine. Yeah. Folks get down in the sunshine. Sunshine. Folks get round in the sunshine. Feel what I feel when I feel what I feel when I feel it in the sunshine. Feel what I feel when I feel when I feel when I feel it in the sunshine. Do what I do when I do what I do when I do it in the sunshine. Do what I do when I do what I do when I do it in the sunshine. Sunshine. Everybody loves the sunshine. Sunshine. Flow gets down in the sunshine. Sunshine. Everybody loves the sunshine. Sunshine. Everybody loves the sunshine.
Sì, sì, intanto stiamo in piedi là. Caesar, yeah. Yeah, Caesar, must be the name of Caesar. Posso vedere questo? La lascia qua. To introduce us. And that's you, that's me, and there's Cordosius and someone else.
Here we are. Okay, good morning. So we begin with the second session of the day. And first of all, I would like to thank again the organizers of this wonderful Congress, which gives us possibility to meet, though at distance, for this quite important topic. And I may say that Minqi Chu, who is going to speak now, is somehow a symbol of what we are trying to do here, since after studying at Beijing University, she came to Europe, where she spent, I think, 1 year at Thessaloniki, at the Aristotle University with Professor Christos Arabatsis. And then, after that, thanks to a scholarship granted by the Chinese government, she came to Paris, where she is PhD candidate at the Sorbonne and at the School for Advanced Studies in Social Sciences. Her research focuses on manuscripts in southern Italy, Greek manuscripts in southern Italy in the Middle Byzantine period, with a special focus on secular texts. But here she is going to talk about a topic that is of particular interest for us, which is the use of paper in Byzantium, some remarks, and a case study.
It's up to you.
Okay, dear professors, dear ladies and gentlemen, thanks for coming. And today my topic is about the use of paper in Byzantium. Studies on the invention of paper in China and its gradual spread to the West and to Byzantium in particularly with Arab mediation do not seem to have any particular developments in recent years. In fact, the picture seems clear. Invented in ancient China before the 1st century AD, a good part of paper circulated in Byzantine Empire was directly coming from Eastern Arabian world, at least up to the 13th century, when Western paper and more precisely Spanish and Italian papers were imported into Byzantium. The paleographers call this type of ancient paper Arabic Oriental paper. In the first part of my paper, I will focus on the period in which Arabic Oriental paper was used in Byzantium. In the second, I will concentrate on a case study, the Greek manuscript Vaticanus Greecus 504, copied in 1105. In order to show how complicated could be the construction of a codex in the first centuries of use of this kind of material. It's not, it doesn't work. Where? Okay, it's changed. Okay, thank you. So all this Greek paper manuscript that has come down to us is the Vaticanus Greecus 2200, copied around the year 800, probably in the milieu of Jerusalem Patriarchate. This codex, which contains a collection of dogmatic contexts, including extracts from some concile, was thus produced in a context of Greek Orthodox culture and religion, but in a region dominated by the Caliphate. It's interesting to note that the Vatican manuscript is a book document and can be considered a symbol of the fact that the use of paper involved both in the production of books and documents. In the catechisms of written by Theodore of Studis in the 8th, 9th century and in the Administrator Imperial, the word Hartopios and Hartopii is attested, but it seems that the word Hartes, which originally indicates the black papyrus scroll designated between antique and the Middle Age, the scroll, whatever its material was. And the use of paper became already popular in Byzantium from the 11th century. The statistics by Nicholas Economizet shows that from 1052 to the end of 12th century, all imperial crystal balls seem to have been on paper. Paper has thus taken place of parchment in the imperial chancellery, at least in some kind of documents. During the 11th and 12th century, more than 78% of official or private documents preserved until now were written on paper. Economization also shows that paper documents circulate not only in Constantinople, but also in other areas of the empire. In the same period, the Arabic Oriental paper, sometimes named Vagzatikos, with reference to the Vagzat or more often but later Bambigonos, with reference to the Eastern Cotton type paper as opposite to the Western type. As I said, besides the documents, paper was also used in making codex. In 1077, the typical of the monastery of Panagiotopoulos in Constantinople was first composed and signed by its founder, Michael Adeliades, a high imperial official and historian. This typical listed the monastery's properties, including 28 books and at least 5 of which are in paper. They all contain theological texts. A bibliography produced by the Library of the Monastery of Patmos in 1201 shows that before the 13th century, this monastery possessed 330 books, and among them 63 are in paper. In addition to the historical records, useful information comes from Greek manuscripts preserved in existing libraries. John Lijuan had listed in some non-classical articles are part of dated Greek paper codices copied up to the 12th century. Moreover, according to the statistic of Procana, 67 of 573 Greek manuscripts in 11th and 12th century now in the Vatican Library are made of paper, and 40 of 845 in the National Library of France. Nevertheless, not all these Greek paper manuscripts were produced within the Byzantine Empire. Some of them came from Northern Italy or other Greek-speaking areas outside of the empire. We thus have no evidence that the Byzantines themselves fabricated paper as of the beginning of the 12th century imply an interesting difference between the use of parchment and paper. The monks and the monasteries Hellenic, founded by Emperor Giarenis, the wife of Aristotle, the first Komnenos, copied 4 examples of their typical, including a volume, a property of the country. 3 of them parchment were conceived to be preserved in the archive and paper for daily use.
广播声传来，全场的恒大球迷整齐地喊着郑州的名字，这个是郑智吧？这其中也有鲁鲁的声音，是不是啊？因为他进了一球，然后呢，他的球迷啊都可开心了，是不是啊？都在那喊加油，加油，太厉害！
This manuscript was copied by just one scribe named Ioannis to Halzo, a monk from Mount Athos. According to the subscription, he accomplished his transcription in July of 1105. Since before our manuscript, he copied another codex in 1086, the Moscow Synod Greek 29, a collection of some authentic treasures. He was active between the end of the 11th century and the beginning of the 12th century. The Vaticanus contains an extremely complex collection of texts, mostly Greek patristic works by Alexander of Cyprus, John of Damascus, Maxim the Confessor, and Pseudo Dionysius the Areopagite, as well as various short texts, holy commentary, and excerpts. Among these theological texts, there is just one profane text by Ammonius. It is difficult to find a coherent logic in the arrangement of these texts, and it seems that our copyist hasn't planned a complete organization before his transcription. In fact, our copyist John used different models in his transcription. The folios 11 recto to 17 recto, containing actually a corpus of Pseudo Dionysius of Areopagite, derived from one, and at the end we could find a notice from the copyist, probably copied from his model, Delos in Dis Fibula. A list of excerpts from Patrick's work on folios 96 recto to 103 recto probably came from another independent model. The codicological characteristics supported the independence of this part, while the text contained in the first part are on 2 columns. The ones on folios 96 recto to 103 recto are on 1 column surrounded by the commentaries. This switch is probably due to the different mise-en page of the 2 models. Besides, it is possible to say that the text on folios 194 recto to 197 recto and 3 recto to 4 recto is copied from a 3rd model, the Moscow Flood 200. Thus, our copyist John collected at least 3 different models for transcribing this manuscript, and he faithfully copied his models respecting their layout. In brief, the strange disposition of the text and the incoherent mise-en-page implies that our copyist didn't establish a whole play before transcribing his models. But there is more. The in-text in folios 1 and 2 records the text until the first column of folio 176, but does not mention at all the text from the second column of the folio 176 until the last folio, nor the ones on folios 3 recto to 4 recto. This exclude context was thus entered by our copyist John after the accomplishment of the in-text. Let's now turn to the most interesting aspect, the structure of this codex, whose format is actually large, 322 mm in length and 275 mm in width. It is mainly composed of Arabic Oriental paper, preciously in folios 5 to 170 and 157 to 119. There is more than 70%. The rest, folios 116 to 156 and 191 to 197 is made of parchment, and folios 1 to 4 of palimpsest parchment. Some scholars hypothesize that the paper's part was aged later, but this cannot be the case, since all folios are written by one and the same copyist. Besides, a quite astonishing detail deserves to be stressed. 60 folios of the manuscript were produced by small pieces done together. This phenomenon is essentially concerns the part in paper. In folios 74 to 105, except the two folios 82 and 83, our copies added two strips of paper to the two sides in order to enlarge the surface of the original folios. This type of collage implies that the original folios had been originally conceived in order to be a part of another codex. The two bundles of paper which are used to enlarge these folios probably come from the trimming of another manuscript. The same enlargement took place in folios 158, 162 to 166. Besides this type of collage, folios 157, 158, 164, and 165 are the result of a more complex one. Folio 157 is composed of 5 bands of paper stuck together vertically, and folios 175/4. On the other side, folios 159 and 164 are composed of more than 6 small pieces of paper, which are almost certainly the fruit of the production of other folios. A similar phenomenon of collage also concerns the parchment folios. In palimpsest folios 1 to 3, as well as folios 133 to 140 and 195, 1 or 2 strips of parchment have been added to the edges. In folios 116 and 117, more than 3 strips and smaller pieces of parchment were attached. The fourth palimpsest folio, as well as folios 191 to 194 and 196, were all made of small pieces and small fragments. Here's, for instance, the folio 194, consisting of 10 small pieces stuck together. To sum up, our manuscript was produced thanks to the reuse of many tiny pieces of parchment and paper, probably resulting from the activities connected to the production or trimming of other codices. The difference in the quality of parchment folios and the pieces used in the different parts of the manuscript also supports this idea. In fact, some parchment folios are of medium quality and their color is yellow, for example, the folio 140, while some of them are of poorer quality with visible pores, for example, the folio 195 vexel. However, parchment folios in excellent quality with smooth surface and almost white in color. The example is the folio 127 recto, also could be found in this manuscript. This variety of quality is another confirmation of the fact that the parchment folios and the pieces were originally produced to give birth to very different codices, as shown in the case of the first folio vexel, where different parts present different colors. And the reuse of remaining materials from other codices as well as useless fragments can be interpreted in two ways. The first is that the monastery where the copyist copied our manuscript is quite poor. John has thus to use darker pieces of parchment and paper. The second is quite the opposite. The monastery in which John lived was in fact not that poor. The disposition of many models and the abundance of pieces coming from the production and the trimming of other manuscripts might therefore depend on the fact that the monastery was the center of a quite intensive activity of transcription and book production. If this second hypothesis is real, then John probably designed to reuse all pieces at his disposal. So this is a very rare case. We may think about that other codices of the same nature were produced in Middle Byzantine periods and they got lost since their very modest aspect did not imply a preservation on the long term. In fact, the somehow chaotic way John copied this anthology and the way he subscribed it make it possible that it was conceived by himself as a personal book. Be that as it may, this manuscript is also quite important since it shows that the use of paper is frequent among our sources at the beginning of the 12th century. Otherwise, our copies could not gather such a large number of paper folios and pieces of paper. Thus, this hypothesis that our manuscript, mainly composed of Arabic Oriental paper, was produced for private daily use, somehow recalls the typical of the monastery tis Kehali domains we quoted above. In conclusion, since the most ancient Greek paper manuscript was produced around the year 800 in Palestine, and our codex seem to prove that among others, Arabic Oriental paper was largely used at late at the 1105. We have to assume that Arabic Oriental paper spread in Byzantium during the 9th to 10th century, so the sources are rare. During the 11th and 12th centuries, this type of paper was largely used to produce both documents and codices. As a material more fragile than parchment, paper seems more likely to be chosen for daily use rather than permanent preservation. And in calculating its spread, we must assume that a much larger number of manuscripts and documents written on paper than on parchment is lost. It is interesting to note that the case study of the Vaticanus Grecus 504 shows the importance of the manuscript, which are usually ignored because of their poor aspect and textual quality. This very modest manuscript, mainly composed of Arabic Oriental paper, transcribed by a monk from others, who chaotically copied the text from at least 3 different models with no planification of his work, no uniformization of the layout, was almost certainly a book that John produced for himself, and that was probably not destined to survive it. The Hassar preserved it, and it comes to our head like a very precious and rare example of almost untested codicological practices. Thank you.
So thank you to Minqi Chu for this talk on this actually astonishing example. I've never met a manuscript like that, produced in this way. And okay, I think there will be some questions later. Now it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Frederick Lauritzen, who is the author of many books, articles, critical editions on quite different topics and authors, from Plato and Aristotle to Psellos and Alexios Thukydides, to quote just a few. And an important part of his work focuses on religion and philosophy in Byzantium. Frederick read classics at New College, Oxford, obtained a doctorate in classics from Columbia University in New York, with a thesis on the chronography of Michael Psellos, which was published. And then he was in Bologna for some years, and since 2017, he has been a historian at the Scuola Grande di San Marco in Venice. The title of his lecture is Michael Psellos and China.
Thank you very much, Filippo, for the introduction. And I'd like to thank also Professors Arabatsis and Koukoussas for inviting me here for a wonderful opportunity to talk about Byzantium and China, a topic which is difficult, but very interesting, and I think very promising as well. So let's see if we can go back somehow. I got it. Yeah, it's working, so that's fine. Thank you very much. One may single out two main ways to compare Byzantium and China, either to focus on the contacts or establish structural parallels between aspects of their societies. Psellos allows one to do both at once. The North Song dynasty, which ruled between 960 and 1127, and the Macedonian dynasty from 867 to 1057 overlap during Psellos' lifetime. And for ease, I've put a map here on the PowerPoint where you can see the Song dynasty, the size of China at that point. And then obviously you're familiar with the Byzantine Empire and Psellos' lifetime. So it's slightly different for what's on the map. During his lifetime, both cultures had prominent bureaucracies which appear to be directly involved in the main cultural production, especially literary. Bureaucrats were writers. The period which mainly concerns us is between the Qingli reforms of around 1043 and the new policies of Wang Anshi, 1021-1086. So that's a period in the 1070s, let's say, minister under Emperor Shenzong, 1069-1076. The period corresponds exactly to Psellos' period at court. The connections and parallels are evident in the two Chinese texts describing two embassies of the 11th century. From, forgive my pronunciation, Xinjiang Shu, chapter 221, written in the mid-11th century, to Song Shi of chapter 490, written in the late 13th century for the period 960-1279. And I'm using Herth's translations, obviously, because I don't know Chinese. The text describes something exotic and rather unfamiliar to the Chinese reader, and therefore extremely useful for the Byzantinist. The first text is dated to around 1060 and is entitled Tang Shu, chapter 221. This is page 56 of Herth. The imperial palace is described at 57, as well as different aspects of imperial administration. The Chinese description fits remarkably well with what we know from the imperial palace, but describes it from an ambassador's point of view. I quote the translation, obviously. The royal palace has 3 portals which are beset with precious stones. The 3 main gates should be identified with the doors leading into the consistorium, as described by Constantine Porphyrogennetus. And I quote the passage here. In this case, the admissionalios must bring the ambassador and places him at the wall before the velum of the great summer consistory. 3 doors of the consistory are open if he bears horses among his gifts. The 3 hanging curtains are made of silk. And after all of the rulers are received, the maestros summons thus, and quote, Yezdekos, ambassador of Khosroes, king of Persia, and those who have accompanied him and bring horses, unquote. It may appear as a hypothesis, but the text of Constantine Porphyrogennetus gives us an important clue to identify this location. He says the ambassadors waited in front of the gates together with their interpreters. This is logical, but explains how the Chinese text came into being. The description is based on what an ambassador saw of the palace. He would wait before these particular 3 doors. He would then receive a signal to enter the consistorium. In another passage of Constantine, more details are given on this very same procedure. The ambassador waits in the Scuola of the Magistros, and after the rulers have been received and entered into the consistory, the admissionalios, the cartulari of the barbarians and the interpreters must bring in the ambassador and make him sit in the anti-consistory. The cartulari and interpreters give the convocation to the admissionalios, and the rest happens like in the Silentium. So it's very interesting. We have people who can speak, they can interpret, and we have people who are carrying documents which are translated and in the original. That's why you have various people. So it's a whole team of people going in for each foreigner. Indeed, the Chinese description focusing on the 3 doors is important since he waited there before being admitted. And my guess is that he waited a long time in front of those 3 doors, which is why he remembered it. One should not forget the runic inscriptions of Hagia Sophia are the result of prolonged boredom. He describes the admission. Indeed, the emperor has given the sign kelefsis, and kelefsis is a technical term, to enter into the consistorium. The description seems rather accurate, and the Byzantine and Chinese sources appear to coincide. This allows one to confirm that the Chinese text was composed by an ambassador or by someone who knew about the ambassadorial report, who represented his country to the Byzantine emperor. He then describes his entry into the consistorium. That's why I think those 3 gates are the ones of the consistorium, precisely because he describes the gates and then says he goes in. That's the key proof, I think. He then describes the entry into the consistorium, but does not describe the automata famous from the description of Liutprand of Cremona, unless the bird with green feathers, which moves, is part of this throne mechanism. There's a very strange passage there. It would confirm the description is generally from the time of the Macedonian dynasty, given that the automata seem to be from the time of Basil I or Leo VI. Also, the Chinese text mentions another automaton, a sort of calendar, a sort of clock, a golden clock, but I've left that out because it's complicated to understand what it is. So that he is seeing automata. Oh, let's see. There we are. Striking is a description of 12 persons with whom the emperor shares government. And I quote here the translation of the Chinese text. 12 honored ministers have joint charge of government. When the king goes out, a man follows him with a bag, and whatever complaints there are may be thrown into the bag. On returning, he examines right and wrong. One may imagine that Psellos could have been one of these people, one of the 12, or one of the people bearing the petitions. The reason being that he dedicated several encomia to Constantine X, who was emperor between 1059 and 1067. If he was not directly present, he would have known the person who provided the emperor with petitions, Alivelisios, so Psellos is friends with a lot of those, as described in this passage. He would also have known the person who admitted persons into the consistorium. He would have known the admissionalios. This is clear from the Chronographia, where in books 6 and 7, he is clearly describing the workings from within the palace. He witnessed the emperor receiving ambassadors. Here's a description of Isaac I Komnenos. And here you see it on the slide, the same passage. I'm reading the translation I made. I expected the best, also on account of this man's character, which one had encountered since a while. But as soon as he sat on the bema, either to deal with matters or to give presents to ambassadors or to punish barbarians most sternly, he became curt and harsh, and one would have never thought that he could have turned out rather weak. Psellos, like the Chinese ambassador, has seen physically the emperor sitting on the throne, receiving the ambassadors. And that happens in the consistorium. And he's sitting on the vima, he's sitting on the bema, which is described in the De Ceremonis. So the scene is set. Psellos saw the emperor receive ambassadors, the same way described in a Chinese source during the Song dynasty. Their paths may have crossed in Constantinople in the consistorium of the imperial palace.
see if I can get to the next. Ah, there it is. The second text reveals a Byzantine embassy in China. During the 10th month of the 4th year of the period Yuan Feng, November 1081, their king, Mieli Ling Kaiser, apparently Michael VII Parapinakis, sent the first Ta Shu Ling, a high official, Ni Si Tu Ling Si Meng Pan, to offer as tribute saddled horses, sword blades, and real pearls. He said the climate of this country is very cold. Houses there have no tiles. The products are gold, silver, pearls, western silk, cloth, cows, sheep, horses, camels with a single humps, pears, almonds, dates, palan, millet, wheat. They make wine from grapes. Their musical instruments are the lute and the pienku, the side drum. The king dresses in red and yellow robes and wears a turban of silken cloth interwoven with gold thread. The emperor is Michael VII Parapinakis. Scilitis Continuatus tells us he was known only for debasing coinage. Quote, for if someone said Michael without adding Parapinakis, he would not point succinctly to the well-known fact, since at that time one could buy a nomisma short of a pinakion. The Chinese source indicates that the emperor put his name on coins, which can't have been very unusual because all Byzantine emperors put their name on coins. But he points this out, and I think he points it out because he's rather surprised. Because since the coin was debased, the emperor had put the name on a coin that was of the wrong value. So it was illegal. And in fact, I think what proves it is the fact that the next sentence, he says that no private individual can make their own coins. So he's pointing out a problem of authority and standard weight, which is a very bureaucratic way of looking at these things. The same embassy also mentions the fact that each town and province was governed by a bureaucrat. For the Byzantines, it mainly meant the krite at this time, the krites or kritai. The passage also described the village and the taxes it paid. And this is very surprising. And I quote the Chinese text you see on the slide. The towns and country districts are under the jurisdiction of a shuling. Twice a year during summer and autumn, they must offer money and cloth. These are the village communities studied by Alexander Kashdan in 1961. Based on the text called the Ashburner Treatise or the Martian Treatise on Village Taxation. So this is very important because we tend to think of these legal texts as being very abstract with no real application. What the Chinese are describing here is how it's practically collected. So twice a year. June and September would be a good bet for various reasons. The Song Chronicle describes the punishment, but Psellos' presence may be seen in the background. The Song Chronicle describes the punishment for parricide as capital punishment is administered by putting the culprit into a feather bag, which is thrown into the sea. That's the famous Roman punishment of putting someone who'd killed his father, committed parricide, was put in a bag with a monkey, a chicken, a dog, and a snake, and then thrown in the river Tiber. This is called the Poena Kulei, and it's described in the Digest, in the Institutes, as well as Theophilos Antekesor. The Basilica seemed to indicate that this type of punishment was no longer in use in 892, though it is present in the Scuola. The only way the Chinese text could report such a punishment is if someone aware of Byzantine law had told him. this would be someone who had read the Scholia to the Basilica. And one has to remember that some of the new Scholia of the Basilica were written by Xifilinos, friend of Psellos. So we're looking at a time when people are discussing these topics exactly in the 11th century. Thus, the ambassador knew Byzantine law described village administration, as well as explaining how the coinage was debased, which anyone would have noticed by simply weighing the metal. Given that more than half of Psellos' letters are written to Crite, who needed to judge exactly these points, it appears that embassies were received by people like Psellos and staffed by people like him. One may think of Psellos' embassy to the future emperor Isaac Komnenos. This would explain why Psellos seems to have links with people who know foreign languages. Simeon Seth knew Arabic, Grigor Magistros, the governor of Vaspurakan in 1054, who died in 1054, knew Armenian, the grammarian from Abkhazia, to whom we have a letter, John Italos probably knew Latin and some form of Italian, Ioannis Petrizzi knew Georgian. These were not just acquaintances, but probably those who worked as hermeneute to translate at court. Psellos himself wrote a letter to Malik Shah, which must have been translated for the recipient. Therefore, the imperial bureaucracies were in direct contact. It is a cliché to indicate that both empires used highly educated civil servants. However, structural parallels could be easily pointed out, such as the ministers Nikiforitsis under Nikiforos III Votaniatis and Anshi Wang, exact contemporaries and reformers. Moreover, the question of state intervention in the economy, and specifically the role of monopolies, is also similar and very important at this time. Another important parallel is that bureaucratic internal questions, often highly sophisticated, did not prevent or even predict sometimes the military defeats that would follow. One may indicate Manzikert in 1071 as a symbol for the Byzantines and the Jing-Kang incident of 1127 for the Northern Song dynasty. Psellos, moreover, is uniquely important parallel for Chinese history, since his action corresponds to the period between the Qingli reforms of 1043 and the new policy of Wan Anshi. Moreover, the critic of these reforms, again, you have to correct my pronunciation, Su Shi, the poet, was also part of an important trial against him because he had attacked the reforms. This is in exactly the same years of the trial of John Italos, who is condemned. Therefore, these two Chinese texts accurately described elements of Byzantine court culture and administration at the time of Psellos. This means that in the period of Psellos' lifetime, one may unify the structuralist approach with the study of effective contacts between the Byzantine Empire and China. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frederick. Many thanks for this beautiful walk, pilgrimage, I would say, from China to the Imperial Palace. And we've been able to see the court rituals in this double transcultural perspective. Thank you very much. So I think that now it is time for us to welcome Professor Michael Kordosis. It is, in fact, not necessary to introduce Professor Kordosis, but I will do that anyway, because this is my role. And he's Professor Emeritus of the University of Ioannis. I studied Byzantine history, historical geography at the University of Ioannis in London. Professor Kordosis has taught at Ioannis and at Changchun Normal University, Jilin, in China. And during his long career, he's lectured all over the world, and particularly in China, especially on the topic of that Gaydors, as
here today. His research has focused in particular on historical and geographical aspects relating to Greece, the Far East, but also India and Middle East, Central Asia. Among his works, I think it is important to remember and to mention his book on the historical topography of the region of Corinth in the Middle Ages, published in 1981, his groundbreaking book on China and the Greek world in 1991, but also his more recent work on Tang China, Nestorian China's Church and the Heretical Church of Byzantium in 2008, and finally, his book on Alexandria, on the Oxus River in 2015. It is therefore an honor for me and for us to introduce Professor Michael Korkoudosis, who will deliver the last lecture of this colloquium before Professor Koukoussas' conclusions. The title of his paper is Sino-Byzantine Studies, Areas of Research and Further Prospects. Thank you.
I must sit down. Or what?
Συνεννοήθηκα με τον κύριο Αραμπατζή να τα διαβάσω στα ελληνικά και να τα δείχνουμε στα αγγλικά. Έχω όμως και το αγγλικό χειρόγραφο, εάν θέλετε στα αγγλικά, εάν πρέπει μάλλον. Νομίζω ότι καλύτερα είναι στα ελληνικά για να προσθέσω και μερικά πράγματα που δεν έχω στο αγγλικό, αφού θα φαίνεται το κείμενο. Το δυτικότερο κράτος της Οικουμένης στις παλαιότερες κινέζικες πηγές ονομάζεται Λικάν, ταυτιζόμενο φωνητικά με το κράτος των Σελευκιδών ή με την Αλεξάνδρεια και αργότερα τους πρώτους χριστιανικούς αιώνες Τατσίν, που σημαίνει Μεγάλη Κίνα. Το Τατσίν ταυτίζεται με το ρωμαϊκό κράτος από τους περισσότερους ερευνητές, με πρώτο και σημαντικότερο τον Φρέντερικ Χίρθε, ήδη από το 1800, εξαιτίας της θέσης του κράτους αυτού στο τέρμα της Δύσης, αλλά και για πολλούς λόγους, παραδείγματος χάρη την πρεσβεία που έστειλε το 166 μετά Χριστόν ο βασιλιάς του Άντουν, που ταυτίζεται με τον Μάρκο Αβρίλιο Αντωνίνο. Η πραγματική όμως φύση του μεγάλου και φημισμένου αυτού κράτους της Δύσης αποκαλύπτεται όταν γίνει σύγκριση ανάμεσα σε Ινδική πηγή, Μιλίντα Πάνχα, ερωτήσεις του Μενάνδρου.
晚上是不是妈妈？晚上是不是鼠小弟就在这儿睡？晚上是不是鼠小弟在这儿睡啊？
Στην προοδευτική Ινδία, υπό τον βασιλιά Πενάνδρο, το μεγαλύτερο από τους Έλληνες στην Ινδία μετά τον Μέγα Αλέξανδρο. Εξάλλου, το Τατσίν είναι μια από τις γλώσσες της Κεντρικής Ασίας και αυτή βέβαια δεν μπορεί να είναι τα λατινικά. Γεωγραφικά, το Τατσίν της Δύσης ταυτίζεται από τους περισσότερους ερευνητές με περιοχές της Ανατολικής Μεσογείου όπου ζούσαν Έλληνες, έχοντας ως πρωτεύουσα την Αντού, δηλαδή της Αντιόχεια και όχι. Τελευταία, για το κράτος αυτό έγιναν 3 διατριβές στην Ελλάδα από Κινέζους φοιτητές. 2 στα Γιάννενα από τους Τσάνγκ Σισάν και Λιτσιάν και μια στη Θεσσαλονίκη από τον Τσάνγκ Τσιτσιάν. Και οι 3, ιδιαίτερα ο Τσάνγκ Σισάν, τώρα καθηγητής στο Πανεπιστήμιο Τσινχουά του Πεκίνου, είναι χαρακτηριζόμενη βιβλιογραφία από τον Φιλίππο Ρονκόνι. Από γεωγραφικής και τοπογραφικής πλευράς, οι κινέζικες δυναστειακές ιστορίες είναι πολύ ενημερωμένες, αναφέρονται στους σταθμούς του λεγόμενου δρόμου του μεταξιού, μερικοί από τους οποίους, από τη Συρία ως την Κεντρική Ασία, ταυτίζονται με αντίστοιχους σταθμούς στη γεωγραφία του Πτολεμαίου. Η όμως έκπληξη βρίσκεται στο τέλος των κινέζικων οδηπορικών προς τη Δύση. Πριν την Αντιόχεια, απαριθμούνται τα μικρά ενδιάμεσα βασίλεια και ο τρόπος που φτάνει κανείς εκεί, μέσω ξηράς ή θαλάσσης, που δεν ταυτίζονται με περιοχές της Συρίας, όπως γράφτηκε από μερικούς ερευνητές, Φρέντερικ Χίρθ και άλλους, αλλά με αρμενικές σατραπίες του Άνω Ρου, του Τίγρη και του Εφράτη, ποτάμιο σύστημα που λογίζεται στα κινέζικα χρονικά ως θάλασσα. Δεν πρόκειται για μια φανταστική θάλασσα, όπως πιστεύει ο Ιάπωνας ερευνητής Κουρακής Σιρατόρη. Ούτε όμως πρόκειται για τον Περσικό κόλπο, όπως πιστεύει ο Χίρθ, εκτρέποντας το εμπόριο από την Βαβυλώνα γύρω από την Αραβική Χερσόνησο, πράγμα απίθανο. Η αντίληψη αυτή είχε ως αποτέλεσμα να ταυτιστεί το Τατσίν με άλλες χώρες ακόμα και με τη Σαουδική Αραβία. Με τον Χέρμαν, μολονότι ήταν έμπειρος ερευνητής. Είναι ένα πρόβλημα που έχει λυθεί, πιστεύω, αλλά δεν αποκλείεται κανείς, ίσως καμιά φορά το Τακίν, με άλλη χώρα. Ενασχόλησε με τη γεωγραφία των περιοχών αυτών, πάντως, με βάση τις πληροφορίες των κοινωνικών πηγών, και ακόμα πολλά να προσφέρει. Το όνομα και το άλλο του θηλυκού για τους Κινέζους κράτους του Φουλίν προέρχεται σίγουρα από τη Ρώμη, Φρόμ, και όχι από άλλες ονομασίες, παραδείγματος χάρη πόλης, Κωνσταντινούπολης, που ήταν η πιο πιθανή παλιά, Βιθλεέμ κλπ. Όπως αποδεικνύεται εξάλλου και από την ιστοριανή στήλη της Ιάν, όπου το όνομα Εφρέμ αποδίδεται σε Συριακά ως Φουλίν. Ακόμα και το Εφράτης έχει παρόμοια απόδοση. Είναι θάμνη της περίοδου των δυναστιών του στον Τang, 618 μετά, όταν ανταλλάσσονται πρεσβείες ανάμεσα στο Βυζάντιο και την Κίνα, γνωστές μόνο στις κινέζικες πηγές. Όχι η εκκλησία στην Κίνα, υποστήριξε την Κίνα Πέρση Πεσχιλιά, όπως γράφεται, όπως λέγεται, από τους περισσότερους, αλλά του Βυζαντίου. Είναι ιστοριανοί, μολονότι αιρετικοί, ενεργούν ως σύνδεσμος ανάμεσα στις δύο χώρες και η σημασία τους για τις συνοβυζαντινές σχέσεις είναι τεράστια. Φουλίν, λοιπόν, είναι το Βυζάντιο, συνέχεια του Τατσίν, από γεωγραφικής και επιθυμιακής πλευράς, για το οποίο οι γνώσεις των Κινέζων φτάνουν τώρα ως την πρωτεύουσά του, τη μυθική Φουλίν, ένα της ειδικότερης φιλικοσφωνής, όπως σχηματίζεται και στο κινέζικο χάρτη. Πρόκειται για πιο ακριβείς πληροφορίες, αποτέλεσμα νεότερων γεωγραφικών γνώσεων που αλλάζουν τη θέση της πρωτεύουσας από την Αντιόχεια στην Κωνσταντινούπολη και των τρόπων προσέγγισή της. Ταύτιση λοιπόν του παλιότερου Τατσίν, που σήμαινε χώρα των Ελλήνων, με τη Φουλίν από τα τέλη του 6ου αιώνα, με την ίδια σημασία, είναι πολύ πρώιμη. Η Φουλίν θα είναι τώρα η θελική χώρα, μολονότι στην αρχή από τους Άραβες δεν διαλύθηκε όπως υπόσε. Αγωνίζεται εναντίον τους σε συνεργασία με τους Κινέζους και τα βασίλεια ή πριγκιπάτα της Κεντρικής Ασίας που συντονίζονταν εναντίον του κοινού εχθρού. Η συνεργασία αυτή πιστεύουμε ότι ήταν βασική για την αντίσταση εναντίον των Αράβων. Ύστερα από τον ερχομό των Σελτζούκων, που κατέλαβαν τμήματα της Μικράς Ασίας, η Φουλίν της δυναστείας του Σουμ ίσως πρέπει να ταυτιστεί με τους Σελτζούκους, δεδομένου ότι τα χαρακτηριστικά της είναι διαφορετικά. Προλίγου ακούσαμε διαφορετική ερμηνεία, με αρκετά επιχειρήματα. Ενώ αργότερα η Φουλίν των Μιν, 1468-1643, σε μια πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα αφήγηση για τη χώρα αυτή που προσφέρουν τα κινέζικα χρονικά, πιθανώς είναι η Κωνσταντινούπολη. Βρισκόμαστε στην εποχή των ευρωπαϊκών σχέσεων με την Ανατολή, ύστερα από την εξόρμηση των Μογγόλων, και είναι εξίσου πιθανό η Φουλίν να επεκτείνεται ως τον Ατλαντικό. Οι κινέζικες πηγές αποκαλύπτουν εμέσως πριν σαφώς ότι οι Κινέζοι γνώρισαν πρώτα τους Έλληνες της Ανατολής, ενώ κυρίως τη μεγάλη μάζα που κατοικούσε στις νότιες υπόρειες του Ινδικού Καυκάσου ως την Πενταποταμία, Ινδικός Καύκασος είναι το Ινδοκούς, γιατί οι Έλληνες υπήρχαν και στη Βακτρία, τις περιοχές βόρεια του Όξου και την Ινδική Χερσόνησο, και εκεί τους δόθηκε το όνομα Τατσίν, που επεκτάθηκε αργότερα και στους Έλληνες της Δύσης. Η ονομασία του Μεγάλη Κίνα ξενίζει, και ο λόγος που επικαλούνται οι κινέζικες πηγές ότι οι κάτοικοι του είχαν τα ίδια χαρακτηριστικά με τους Κινέζους πρέπει να είναι μεταγενέστερη εξήγηση. Είμαι βέβαιος ότι το όνομα σχετίζεται με τους Έλληνες της Ινδίας και μάλλον είναι ανάλογο με τα άλλα όμοιά του. Μεγάλη Ελλάδα στην Ιταλία, Μεγάλη Βουλγαρία στο Βόλγα κλπ. Πάντως η ονομασία που είχε η παραπάνω περιοχή του Ινδικού Καυκάσου, σημερινό και το Ανατολικό Αφγανιστάν, Βόρειο Πακιστάν, Βορειοδυτική Ινδία, Γιώνα, Γιονάκα, Γιαβάνα, Ίωνες δηλαδή Έλληνες, που μεταφράστηκε από τους Κινέζους Τατσίν, δεν ήταν η μόνη που μεταφέρθηκε από την Ανατολή στη Δύση. Ακολούθησε ύστερα από μερικούς αιώνες η μεταφορά του Φουλίν κατά αντίθετη φορά από τη Δύση στην Ανατολή. Πράγμα που παρουσιάζει μεγάλο ενδιαφέρον και αποτελεί, πιστεύω, σημαντικό πεδίο έρευνας. Η παραπάνω ειδικά περιοχή είναι η μόνη ανάμεσα σε όλες τις περιοχές της Ανατολής όπου ζούσαν Έλληνες που ονομάζονται Φουλίν Ρώμη. Σε κινέζικες πηγές και Φρόμο Ρώμη, σε κεντροασιατικές κατά τους 7ο και 8ο αιώνες μετά Χριστόν, ενώ στις Ινδικές τη βρίσκουμε ακόμα με το παλιό γνωστό όνομα Γιαβάνα, το αντίστοιχο του κινέζικου Τατσίν. Είναι, φαίνεται, η περιοχή που συνδέεται άμεσα και με τον Φρόμο Κέζαρο, τον Κέζαρο της Ρώμης στην Ασία. Η έκπληξη για μένα τελευταία είναι ότι υπάρχουν και θηβετιανές πηγές που προσωπικά δεν γνώριζε, οι οποίες κάνουν λόγο για τη Ρώμη του Ινδικού Καυκάσου, αλλά για το κοντινό του κρατικό μόρφωμα Κέσσαρ, που μελέτησε τελευταία ο Στέφανος Κορδώσης στο έργο του για το φρόμο Κέσσαρο της Ασίας, αντλώντας και από το έγκυρο έργο του Μπέκουι, ο οποίος γνωρίζει τη Βετιανά. Από πλευράς ελληνικών πηγών, οι Κινέζοι είναι περισσότερο γνωστοί ως Σύρες και Σίνες, όμως η σημασία των δύο παραπάνω λέξεων δεν είναι πάντα η ίδια. Έτσι, το γνωστό χωρίο του Στράβωνα ότι οι Έλληνες στις Βακτρίες εξέτειναν την ασχή τους ως τους Σύρες και Φρίνες δεν σημαίνει τους Σύρες της Κεντρικής Ασίας, σημερινό κινέζικο Τουρκεστάν, αλλά τους Φουρασινοί, οι Συνδίες, ανατολικότερα του Ύφαση, δεδομένου ότι οι Έλληνες, ιδιαίτερα επί Μενάνδρου, είχαν κυριαρχήσει στο Γάγι, προχωρώντας πέρα από τον Ύφαση, όπου είχε σταματήσει ο Μέγας Αλέξανδρος. Υπάρχουν πράγματι μεταγενέστερες πηγές που τοποθετούν τους Σύρες ανατολικότερα των Ινδών, εννοώντας τους Ινδούς της Πετοποταμίας, Πουντζάμπ. Ο γεωγραφικός αυτός εντοπισμός αλλάζει τα δεδομένα και τοποθετεί το κράτος του μεγάλου Έλληνα βασιλιά Μενάνδρου πολύ ανατολικότερα, για μερικές τουλάχιστον δεκαετίες, χωρίς να ληφθεί υπόψη η βραχύχρονη κατάληψη των Παλιμβόθρων, Παταλιπούτρα, πρωτεύουσα της Ινδίας, που βρισκόταν ακόμη πιο ανατολικά. Αργότερα, και μάλιστα στη βιογραφία του Πτολεμαίου, δεύτερος αιώνας μετά Χριστόν, οι Σύρες τοποθετούνται σαφώς στην Κεντρική Ασία και Βόρεια Κίνα. Ως εκεί έφτανε ο λεγόμενος δρόμος του Μεταξιού, τους σταθμούς του οποίου αναφέρει ο Πτολεμαίος, κατά αντίθετη φορά με εκείνη των κινέζικων χρονικών. Στο κείμενο του Πτολεμαίου δεν υπάρχει λεπτομερής καταγραφή σταθμών μετά την Κεντρική Ασία, το σημερινό Αφγανιστάν, όταν ο δρόμος φτάνει στην απότερη Ανατολή, σε αντίθεση με τα κινέζικα χρονικά που αναφέρονται με λεπτομέρεια στους σταθμούς που βρίσκονται στην απότερη Δύση. Περισσότερες λεπτομέρειες, ωστόσο, παρέχονται από τον Πτολεμαίο και όσους τον ακολουθούν αργότερα και στους σταθμούς και τα λιμάνια του θαλασσινού δρόμου του Μεταξιού, με την αναγραφή πάρα πολλών τοπονημιών επί άπο ανατολικού εδάφους, αποτέλεσμα της ακμής του εμπορίου κατά τους 1ο και 2ο αιώνα μετά Χριστόν. Η αναγραφή αυτή ανταγωνίζεται επάξια τις πληροφορίες των κινέζικων χρονικών για τις νότιες περιοχές του Τατσίν και μάλιστα την Ερυθρά Θάλασσα και την Αίγυπτο, όπου μνημονεύεται και η Αλεξάνδρεια, Τσισάν. Ύστερα από τον Πτολεμαίο, θα έρθουμε στον Κρομά Ινικοπλέφτη, 6ο αιώνα μετά Χριστόν, για να βρούμε νέες ειδήσεις για την Κίνα με το όνομα Τζίνιστα, από τον Τζινιστάν. Οι ειδήσεις αφορούν κυρίως την προώθηση του Μεταξιού και όχι σε νέες περιοχές της Κίνας, ανατολικότερα από εκείνες που μνημονεύει ο Πτολεμαίος. Αλλά δεν νομίζω ότι ισχύει. Η αναφορά του Κοσμά για ύπαρξη θάλασσας ανατολικά της Τζίνιστα οφείλεται στην παλιά αντίληψη για περικύκλωση της ξηράς από τον ωκεανό που επικρατούσε στο Μεσαίωνα και όχι σε νέες γνώσεις. Νέες ειδήσεις για την Κίνα αντλούμε στα τέλη του 6ου, αρχές 7ου αιώνα από τον Θεοφύλακτο Σιμοκάτη ως αποτέλεσμα των σχέσεων των Βυζαντινών με τους Δυτικούς Τούρκους. Ο Σιμοκάτης μνημονεύει την Κίνα με το άγνωστο όνομα Ταβγάστ, πιθανώς από ονομασία τουρκικού φίλου στο βορρά της χώρας, και παρέχει ενδιαφέρουσες νέες ειδήσεις. Ήταν και οι τελευταίες σημαντικές νέες πληροφορίες. Βρισκόμαστε στο Μεσαίωνα, οπότε συνήθως παρατηρείται υποχώρηση και όχι προώθηση των γεωγραφικών γνώσεων, με πηγή κυρίως στην Αγία Γραφή. Μπορεί να μην είναι τελευταίες, όπως ακούσατε στην προηγούμενη ανακοίνωση. Από την άλλη πλευρά, ονόματα, οι τελευταίες νέες εννοώ, έτσι. Από την άλλη πλευρά, ονόματα λαών αλλάζουν θέση. Έτσι, οι Σύρες ονομάζονται τώρα οι Σόγδοι, ανάμεσα στον Όξο και τον Ιεξάρτη, που ήταν οι πιο γνωστοί έμποροι της διακίνησης της Συρικής μετάξης. Για την Άπο Ανατολή, με βάση τις δυτικές πηγές, βρίσκεται σήμερα σε εξέλιξη διατριβή που έχει αναλάβει ο Βασίλειος Ντόβας στο Πανεπιστήμιο Ιωαννίνων. Τα δύο κράτη, οι δύο μεγάλες αυτοκρατορίες, το ανατολικότερο και δυτικότερο σημείο της τότε γνωστής οικουμένης, είχαν όχι μόνο εμπορικές σχέσεις μέσω κυρίως μεταπρατών, αλλά σύμφωνα με κινεζικές πηγές και διπλωματικές σχέσεις, ιδίως κατά τον 7ο και 8ο αιώνα, πράγμα ιδιαίτερα σημαντικό, αφού τούτο αποτελούσε τη βάση της συνεργασίας τους, προσφέροντας ειδήσεις μάλιστα σε μια από τις πιο φτωχές εποχές της βυζαντινής ιστορίας. Χωρίς να ληφθούν υπόψη η διακίνηση ταξιδιωτών και θρησκευτικών αποστολών, νεστορανοί χριστιανοί, μανιχαίοι, Εβραίοι κλπ. Οι σχέσεις αυτές συνέχισαν να καλλιεργούνται έως και 1,5 αιώνα μετά την εμφάνιση και εξάπλωση των Αράβων, μέσω κυρίως του βόρειου δρόμου του Μεταξιού, ο οποίος βρισκόταν εκτός αραβικού ελέγχου. Τα πεδία έρευνας επί των συνοβυζαντινών σχέσεων, με βάση πρώτα τα αναγραφόμενα στις κινεζικές πηγές, εκτός από φιλολογικά, θα μπορούσαν να ήταν καθαρά ιστορικά, αρχίζοντας από το τέλος της ελληνιστικής περίοδου, από την πλευρά των υπολειμμάτων τόσο των Ελλήνων της Βακτρίας και Ινδίας, όσο και των ελληνιστικών κράτων της Δύσης, Λικάν και Τιαοτσί. Το τελευταίο ταυτίζεται με την υπεροχή Βαβυλωνίας, Μεσίνης και προέρχεται μάλλον από το όνομα Αντιόχεια, αργότερα Χάραξ Σπασίνου. Από τη ρωμαϊκή εποχή, η γεωγραφικά και τοπικά που είναι κύριος τομέας έρευνας, είναι όμως θεμελιώδης σημασίας, χωρίς τη λύση των οποίων η έρευνα είναι επισφαλής. Καθώς ανάπτονται ακόμα και τις ταυτότητες του δυτικότερου στις κινέζικες πηγές κράτους, είπαμε ότι μερικοί του ταυτίζουν με άλλα κράτη, ακόμα και με τη Σαουδική Αραβία, ή του θέματος αν το κράτος αυτό επεκτηνόταν δυτικότερα των επαρχιών Συρία, Παλαιστίνη και Αίγυπτο. Οι Δύση βέβαια πληθαίνουν την Βυζαντινή εποχή. Ενδιαφέρον παρουσιάζουν και τα κοινά στοιχεία που υπάρχουν στις πηγές ανατολικές ή δυτικές, κυρίως κινέζικες και ελληνικές, με τα οποία στην Ελλάδα έχει ασχοληθεί και η Κλέρη Παπαπαύλου, γνωστή ερευνήτρια της σινοϊαπωνικής τέχνης. Όπως και οι μυθικές αφηγήσεις, με τους πραγματικούς πυρήνες που μπορεί να κρύβουν μέσα τους, η τυχόν ύπαρξη ενδιάμεσων κειμένων, τα τοπονύμια και ο βαθμός αλλίωσής τους, η διακίνηση διάφορων προϊόντων εκτός του μεταξιού, πληροφορίες για τους κατοίκους της, εκατέρωθεν ιστορικές ειδήσεις, η προώθηση αντικειμένων τέχνης και νομισμάτων, παραδείγματος χάρη βυζαντινών νομισμάτων στην Κίνα κλπ. Ανάλογοι είναι και οι τομείς που σχετίζονται με τις δυτικές ελληνοανατολικές πηγές, με τις διαφορές τους, κυρίως στο γεωγραφικό τομέα. Είπαμε παραπάνω ότι οι κινέζικες πηγές αποδεικνύονται ακριβείς για το γεωγραφικό τμήμα πριν από την Αντιόχεια και ότι τα αναγραφόμενα τοπονύμια από τον Πτολεμαίο στην Άπα Ανατολή είναι πυκνά. Χρειάζεται όμως προσοχή. Το τελευταίο από αυτά τα κατήγαρα του Πτολεμαίου ταυτίζεται από πολλούς με την Καντόνα. Όμως ο Πτολεμαίος κάνει λόγο για εχθιοφάγους Αιθίωπες, ενώ τοποθετεί τα κατήγαρα λίγο παρακάτω από τον Ισημερινό. Είναι πιθανότερο λοιπόν να πρόκειται για κάποιο από τα πολλά νησιά, αφού βρίσκουμε το σχεδόν ομόεχο Τένκαρα στη νότια Κελέβη, αλλά και νοτιότερα σε συστάδες νησιών. Εξάλλου τα νησιά αυτά εκτείνονται το ένα κοντά στο άλλο, σαν τείχος, πράγμα που συνέβαλε στην αντίληψη του Πτολεμαίου ότι ο Ινδικός ήταν κλειστή θάλασσα. Εκπροσωπεί τις πιο προηγμένες ειδήσεις και όμως λέει ότι ο Ινδικός ήταν κλειστή θάλασσα. Κάτι τα ήξερε παραπάνω. Αλλά όχι όλα. Από τους άλλους συγγραφείς ειδήσεις, εκτός από τον Κοσμά, Ινδικοπλεύστη και τον Θεφίλεκτο Σιμοκάτη, ενδιαφέρον παρουσιάζουν και οι μυμηθικές αφηγήσεις για λαούς του Ινδικού ωκεανού ή γύρω από αυτόν. Νήσος Ντίβα, Σερεντίβα και Ηλάνη, λαός των Βυθσάδων κλπ. Σε συνδυασμό με τα οδηπορικά από το ανατολικότερο σημείο της γης ως το ρωμαϊκό κράτος, όλα κείμενα της πρώιμης βυζαντινής περίοδου, εποχή μετά την οποία δεν συναντώνται στις βυζαντινές πηγές νέες ή πολλές νέες ειδήσεις για την Άπα Ανατολή. Πρέπει όμως να αντιμετωπίζουμε με προσοχή, επειδή είναι μυθικές σε πολλά σημεία, και κριτική διάθεση περισσότερα από τα άλλα κείμενα. Σχετικά με τη Ρώμη, φουλήν της Ανατολής, ως τελευταία πιστευόταν ότι ταυτιζόταν με περιοχή της Βακτρίας ή ακόμη με το ίδιο το Βυζάντιο, τελευταίες δεκαετίες. Βασιζόμενοι σε κινέζικες πηγές, σε συσχετισμό με κεντροασιατικές και κυρίως τιβετιανές πηγές, καταλήγουμε στο συμπέρασμα ότι πρόκειται για ένα ανεξάρτητο ή με ανεξάρτητο κράτος σε μια περιοχή του Ινδικού Καυκάσου, Ινδοκούς, που αποτελούσε εδάφη της Καπεσσινής, βόρεια της Καμπούλ και πρωτοδυτικής Ινδίας. Όπου, καθώς είναι γνωστό, κυρίως τα απονευματικά ευρήματα, επέζησαν στα χρόνια περίπου του Χριστού οι τελευταίοι γνωστοί ανεξάρτητοι Έλληνες βασιλιάδες των ελληνιστικών βασιλείων της Βακτρίας και Ινδίας, μαζί με την περιοχή του Πουτζάν. Αυτοί επέζησαν λίγο παραπάνω, με κέντρο του Σκαφίρ του κεντροανατολικού Αφγανιστάν και του βόρειου Πακιστάν, με τελευταίους σήμερα τους γνωστούς Καλάς. Οι Έλληνες των περιοχών αυτών είναι γνωστοί από τις πηγές της αρχαιότητας, ανάμεσα στις οποίες και τις επιγραφές του μεγάλου Ινδού βασιλιά Σόπερ, 3ου αιώνα μετά Χριστόν, μνημονευόμενοι μερικές φορές μαζί με τους Καμπότζια, πιθανότητα Ιρανική φυλή. Πρόκειται για ανάμεικτη πληθυσμιακά περιοχή, έχοντας νότια άντε στην Καντάρα, με παρσπερμία φυλών, όπου αναπτύχθηκε η γνωστή ελληνοϊνδική βουδιστική τέχνη της Γκαντάρα, αποτέλεσμα συνύπαρξης Ελλήνων, Ινδών, Κουσάνα κλπ. Και αργότερα Εφθαλιτών. Ανάμεσα στα άλλα θέματα που πρέπει να εξεταστούν είναι και η πληθυσμιακή εξέλιξη των Ελλήνων ή Ελληνόφωνων ως τον 7ο και 8ο τουλάχιστον αιώνα, εν μέσω ξένων, κυρίως Ιρακινών πληθυσμών, Ιρανικών πληθυσμών, όπως γίνεται φανερό από θηβετιανές κυρίως πηγές, όντας για κάποια περίοδο δίγλωση. καθώς και σχέσεις τους με το Βυζάντιο σε συσχετισμό με τις βυζαντινοφιλιτιανές σχέσεις που τον 7ο και 8ο αιώνα ήταν στενές. Τα τελευταία υπολείμματα των Ελλήνων αντικαταστάθηκαν κατά τον 9ο αιώνα από τους Μωμεθανούς που κληρονόμησαν και το όνομα Γιαβάνα. Έτσι αναφέρονται οι μουσουλμάνοι στις συνδικές πηγές από το 10ο αιώνα και ύστερα. Οι Ιωνάκα Γιαβάνα του Ινδικού Καυκάσου, Έλληνες, οι Φρόμο, Ρωμαίοι, όπως τους ονόμαζαν, άντεξαν ως ανεξάρτητο ή με ανεξάρτητο κράτος και περισσότερα από 1000 χρόνια μετά την άφηξη του Μεγάλου Αλεξάνδρου στην περιοχή αυτή, όταν ο Μακεδόνας βασιλιάς βρήκε την πόλη Νίσα να έχει ιδρυθεί, σύμφωνα με τις πηγές, από τον Διόνυσο και καταστάθηκαν στην περιοχή Έλληνες και Ελληνόφωνοι κατά κύματα, ιδιαίτερα επί της εποχής των Ελλήνων της Βακτρίας και Ινδίας. Η ιστορία του ανήκει στην ελληνιστική ιστορία, το τέλος της οποίας γνωρίζουμε ότι τοποθετείται στο 30 π.Χ. με την κατάληψη της Αιγύπτου από τους Ρωμαίους. Στη Βακτρία όμως και Ινδία παρατάθηκε αιώνας αργότερα, σίγουρα ως τον 8ο και 9ο αιώνα, με τη Ρώμη του Ινδικού Καυκάσου, ενώ δεν έλειπαν, αν και υπάρχουν μερικά προβλήματα, ενώ δεν έλειπαν και άλλοι ελληνικοί θύλακες στην ευρύτερη περιοχή της Κεντρικής Ασίας και Ινδίας. Το φαινόμενο αυτό είναι συνήθες. Έτσι, μετά τη διάλυση της Ευθαλητικής Αυτοκρατορίας, επέζησαν ευθαλητικά βασίλεια για αιώνες, μόνο που τα ελληνικά κράτησαν περισσότερο χρόνο. Είναι βέβαιο ότι η Ρώμη της Κεντρικής Ασίας ερχόταν σε επαφή με τη Ρώμη της Δύσης, Βυζάντιο, μέσω του Τοχαρεστάν, του κεντροασιατικού κράτους που έφερε το μεγαλύτερο βάρος στον αγώνα εναντίον των Αράβων. Το Βυζάντιο του 7ου και του μεγαλύτερου μέρους του 8ου αιώνα έπαιξε σημαντικότατο ρόλο στα ασιατικά πράγματα, ασκώντας οικουμενική πολιτική, η οποία δεν έληξε το 642 με την κατάληψη της Αλεξάνδρειας, όπως γενικά πιστεύετε, αλλά περισσότερο από 100 χρόνια αργότερα, όταν με τις νέες ιστορικές συνθήκες, εμφύλιο στην Κίνα και λήξη της οικονομαχίας στο Βυζάντιο, οπότε έληξε και η ενοχή για τους αιρετικούς, οι δύο μεγάλες δυνάμεις αποσύρονται από τα τεκτενόμενα στην Κεντρική Ασία με καταλυτικές συνέπειες για την παγκόσμια ιστορία ως αποτέλεσμα της επικράτησης του Ισλάμ. Υπ' αυτήν νομίζω την οπτική πρέπει να εξετάζονται τα ιστορικά γεγονότα στην Ασία. Ως το 781, οπότε με την ύψωση της περίφημης νεστοριανής στήλης στην κινέζικη πρωτεύουσα Σιάν, που μάλλον ήταν μια υπενθύμηση εκ μέρους των Νεστοριανών της παλαιάς συνεργασίας και προσφορών τους προς τον αυτοκράτορα που τώρα τους παραμελούσε, δεν υπήρξε, ετέθη, όπως πιστεύω, η ταφόπλακα στις συνοβυζαντινές σχέσεις, αλλά και ακόμη αργότερα με την εξαφάνιση των Ελλήνων και την κάλυψη του κενού από τους Μουσουλμάνους και μάλιστα τους Τούρκους. Τα παραπάνω θέματα που αφορούν ευρύτερα στην ελληνική ιστορία πρέπει νομίζω να αποτελέσουν αντικείμενο προβληματισμού στο άμεσο μέλλον. Συμπερασματικά, οι συνοβυζαντινές σχέσεις ήταν αρκετά πυκνές, ιδιαίτερα τους σκοτεινούς 7ο και 8ο αιώνα, κυρίως με την αποστολή πρεσβειών και την ακμή των θρησκευτικών αποστολών και αποτελούν ακόμη ανοιχτό πεδίο μελέτης την εποχή μας. Εμφανίζεται δυναμικά και η Ρώμη της Κεντρικής Ασίας. Δεν είναι τυχαίο ότι αυτή ειδικά πήρε το όνομα Ρώμη από όλους τους ελληνικούς θύλακες της Κεντρικής Ασίας και Ινδίας. Σε αυτό συνέβαλαν τρεις λόγοι. Η σχέση της με την φούληνη της Δύσης από πλευράς φιλετικής και επικοινωνιακής, η παρουσία των ελληνόφωνων καφίρ ιδωλολατρών που δεν έγιναν βουδιστές και που οι Κινέζοι ήθελαν πάση θυσία να τους έχουν με το μέρος τους, πάση θυσία, και ο τίτλος του Καίσαρα που έφτασε εκεί στην Καπισινή ερχόμενος από τη Δύση πριν γίνει κτήμα των λαών της περιοχής με το έπος του Καίσαρα, τιβετιανό, μογγολικό κλπ. Να κατακλείζει την Ασία. Στο ερώτημα λοιπόν γιατί κατέκλυσε την Ασία ο Καίσαρ του Βυζαντίου και όχι ο ως του ουρανού της Κίνας, η απάντηση νομίζω δεν είναι μόνο η παρουσία του Βυζαντίου στην Κεντρική Ασία, δεδομένου ότι η παρουσία της Κίνας ήταν πολύ έντονη. Πιστεύω ότι η επικράτηση του Καίσαρα οφείλεται και ή κυρίως στην παρουσία των Ελλήνων της μετέπειτα Ρώμης της Κεντρικής Ασίας. Ο τίτλος του Καίσαρα είχε ήδη φτάσει και η Ρώμη ήταν και κεντροασιατικό κράτος. Ας μην ξεχνάμε ότι οι τιβετιανές πηγές, που είναι οι κύριες πηγές για το έπος του Καίσαρα, μνημονεύουν όχι μόνο κράτος Ρώμη, αλλά και κράτος ίσως πριγκιπάτο Καίσαρ, για το οποίο έχει γράψει ο Στέφανος Πρωτόης στο βιβλίο του για το έπος του Καίσαρα, που πρέπει να εκδοθεί ή να αναζητηθεί στο διαδίκτυο άμεσα. Ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Thank you, Professor Cordosis, for focusing once again on these 4 questions of terminology, semantics, historical geography, and which are strictly connected, hard to solve, and in any case, the very heart of this Congress. Thank you very much. So now, if there are questions for the three talks, we may start with the Minqi Chu. Other questions on this topic? She's been speaking of the use of paper in Byzantium, some remarks and the case study. Yes, one question, Professor Giarenis.
Thank you so much for this very interesting presentation. The quite thought-provocative presentation of the paper condition and the codicological examination of this codex. I found very interesting this case of Vaticanus Grecus, which you showed to us. May I ask you, do you have any thought of the reason of this quite peculiar composition of the codex? Why could it be this peculiarity? Have you thought of that?
Okay.
As you want.
Okay, it works. And what do you mean the particularity? It means that the collage of the folios. Okay, I think it's because I have two reasons. And the first condition, it could be that the monastery is very poor and our copies also. So he must need to use the small pieces and use it for other manuscript or the useless fragment in the cutting and in the trimming of the folios for combine these materials in a new codex and transcribed in these folios. This is the first condition, and the second condition is that maybe he himself and his monastery because his monastery is among us also. I don't think that it will be very poor in the beginning at the beginning of the 12th century. So the condition may be that it means that the folios and it means that the activity of production manuscript in his monastery is very normal. It's a normal thing. So they have many useless fragments and have many folios could be fabricated for other codices. So our copies here probably use the useless fragment and the folios for other manuscripts that think that the remaining part for the other codices, because he want to produce a book for himself, just a private use for himself. So it is convenient that, so I don't think that it's a profit of an excellent manuscript for him for the private preservation or for use in other important occasions. It's just a manuscript for his private and daily use. So he could for the economical problem, like how probably so he used the useless fragments and the remaining part of the remaining folios from the other manuscript to produce a new one.
Thank you. So this could lead us to the assumption that we could speak of a time of the time of the writing. Is it a long period? Even if it was for private use, he could have used one kind of paper or two kinds of paper. It's quite peculiar. That's why I called it peculiar. Could it be that we can think of a long period of time for the writing of the codex? And do we have some hints on this? I mean, does the writing keep the same? I mean, the scribe, does it have the same style?
Any thoughts?
Okay, thank you. I think the kind of paper is just one kind. That is the Arabic Oriental paper, and this is only one type of paper before the 13th century in Byzantium. But it could be possible that our copies for a long period, because as I have shown that the part from the folios 176 vexel to the last folios and the folios 3 vexel to 4 vexel is copied after the general index. So this part may be inserted or written later, maybe 1 year or maybe 20 years ago. But the scribe, I think, is it's the same style. That means the late proscript is an elaboration from the standard proscript, the most popular in the 11th century in Byzantium, to a new style. Thank you.
Thank you to both. Are there other questions for Minqi Chu here or online? No? Okay. So we can pass to Frederick Lauritzen, Michael Psellos, and China. Professor Cordosus.
The paper is very interesting. The paper is very interesting after the theory that merely Shah Kaiser is Melisinos. Now we return in Byzantium, in the theory that the Byzantium is the center, that this description belongs to Byzantium. There are some problems. I was very confused about this narration, and I prefer rather to accept that was not Byzantium but the Turks, because of the difference between this narration and the narrations of Tang Dynasty, etc., and mainly from the information that they send tribute for first time. But perhaps you are right. I must study again and see your paper.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. Obviously, it's I don't know these texts that you're an expert on, but I was just very struck with some peculiarities that one sees in Byzantine administration, yes, in the middle period. What Arveiler had studied in particular, which sometimes is very puzzling when you look at later Byzantine things or earlier ones. So development specifically of the 10th century, 10th, 11th century. Actually, the things that struck me the most were the question of the collecting the taxes from villages, because that seems to reflect very directly this treatise, which is dated to the time of Leo VI. So it's not clear how the system worked, and Kashdan had written that very long book on that and the Book of the Epoch to try and figure out what that meant. But the other thing that struck me was actually the 8 people, the 12 people around the emperor, because that seems to fit with a lot of Greek sources. I don't want to go into it now because it's a long research I'm doing, but it's that's why I said that Psellos could have been one of those people, because basically it's a group of military, it's a group of advisors, and it's a group of possibly ecclesiastics who are there, and the sort of people who listen to the encomia recited to the emperor. So those two features are very strange. And then the added element of the 3 arches. That's why I had on the slide that courtyard, which is in Spalato, which is very beautiful, because in some secondary literature, they say that must be a copy of the imperial consistorium because it has the 3 gates.
So they use that as an image of what the consistorium must have looked like. So that would have been the place where Diocletian received people. So that's strange because those 3 or 4 elements seem so peculiarly Byzantine that I thought we could try and, throw this idea, this bold hypothesis that maybe Psellos is in the background somehow.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
thanks.
There are many arguments.
Of course, absolutely.
Yes. We say, if you can, you could send me your paper.
Yes,
to-
absolutely. No, dude, very happy
to
with
read
any
it,
correction and,
yes.
and all the improvements you can
Okay.
give. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. As you see, this Congress is the perfect place to meet and to exchange. Other questions for Frederick Lauritzen? Professor Giarenis.
Dear Frederick, thank you so much for this very interesting paper. I was very interested in these 12 people. Did you combine this with the 12 didascali, whatever that meant, in Middle Byzantium?
Well, I'm not very clear about how the consistorium looked like, but from what I understand, it had niches, and under each niche was one of the main counselors of the emperor, and they usually were 12. So that's why I was very struck by this text, because it seems to indicate that the texts that refer to how administration worked are not abstract, because foreigners are seeing it working. It's interesting because it's different from Liutprand of Cremona's description, where he focuses on 3 people. So, but there's obviously different types of meetings. So I'm not sure it's a didascali, it may be something more administrative. I don't know if that makes sense.
Thank you so much. This didascalic corpus is a debated one, and perhaps there is a tendency to see in that administrative also function, just for your research, because it's very, very interesting. And of course, it can be combined with a Christian ideology and Christian mentality, the 12 apostles and the emperor, the 13th one.
Yes, no, thank you very much. I'll look into that, and I'll ask you for some help on this topic. That would be great. Thanks.
Other questions for Frederick Lauritzen? So we go on. Questions for Professor Cordosis? Yes? Madame Correa?
Thank you, Professor Cordosis. One small question. You have mentioned the term kafir in your speech. I wonder if you could give me some details more because during the 13th and 14th centuries, I trace it down to many archival testimonies concerning merchants coming from the East. And I thought it meant at least non-Christians, non-fidei, those who are not of our religion, something like that.
Yes. Kafir is a word that means apostasy. Yes, it is from the.
Exactly.
Yes, it is from the Islam, the religion of Islam, and they are known as kafirs in Kafiristan. The opposite is Nuristan, if it is meant. This is the name. They are known with that name. There were idolaters from the beginning. then they didn't become Buddhists like the other Greeks. And was the fear of all the neighbors, especially of the Muslims, until recently. Kafir, άπιστοι για τους μουσουλμάνους. There is an exception in the known site of Ai-Khanum in Oxus that Paul Bernard here Paul Bernard was the main excavator and wrote an article writing not Kafir but barbarous Ai-Khanum, not Kafir Ai-Khanum but barbarous. And this exception is that barbarous was named by this word belongs to the inhabitants, and they were not exactly Kafirs, they were idolaters, but this differentiation is that the Paul Bernard argues that all these people was not remained Greeks for a long time. This is another word, but the word kafir is the known to all of us.
Thank you, thank you. Your interpretation coincides with the impression that I have from the documents. Thank you very much.
Are there other questions for Professor Cordosis? No? So we thank you very much. I thank very much the three speakers, and thank you all for this quite stimulating discussion. Thank you.
Concluding the fifth session, we have reached the discussions of our international conference. I now call Ms. Correa to help us with the final results of the conference.
Well, since I may, dear professors, heads of academic departments and institutions, dear colleagues, guests, participants, ladies and gentlemen. As I have been assigned the task of delaying you a little longer until lunch is ready, let me summarize as briefly as I can the main points of our meeting, as of course I recorded them in my memory and will take with me from this beautiful occasion. Let me begin with our keynote speaker, Professor Filippo Ronconi, who presented an overview of the research of the last 2 decades concerning the relations of the two empires and the topics on which the scholar's interest was headed to. Particularly enlightening was the development of the trends and the main lines of modern scientific research, especially in relation to the cross-examining of the Chinese and Byzantine sources and cross-border studies, comparative studies, climate and migration studies. He's right, and I totally agree,
that stigmatizing terminologies and false mentalities posed a negative perspective in Byzantine Chinese studies up to now. But the future is positive, and this is proven by the annual editions and the programs running about the Byzantine Empire in China as we speak. As I see it, we had two examples of comparative studies already in our conference. The one of the joint presentation of Professor Vasilios Koukousas and Michael Kitiroglu about the imperial worldviews between Byzantium and China, as it seems similarities and differences exist. And it were both that brought them together in the first place. My impression was that the Chinese imperial ideology and structure went far beyond the Byzantine one, but up to a point, they had the same starting lines. The second comparative study, although it was not obvious from the title, was the one of Stefanos Kordosis about the terminology of Caesar Khan and the tradition created around the title. After all, by trying to understand and explain the meaning of things, we compare them with something familiar to us. In the same conceptual environment and with the echo of the archaeological findings in China regarding Byzantine gold coins, we followed the presentation of Professor Ioannis, excuse me for my pronunciation. Her other half, in terms of archaeological evidence, of course, was Professor Wu Chingyuan's speech, we had it already, about the context of and transmission of a Tang Dynasty coin found in 13th century Corinth. We had migration studies too. Professor Pan Kuo-ping contributed a synthesis about the elements of the population crisis in the 7th to 9th centuries in Byzantium and the measures taken to deal with it. Internal moving of populations from one place to another, as well as making settlements of newcomers, was a constant Byzantine practice in all periods of the empire. In fact, the emperors frequently drew from the nomadic tribes that arrived from the Far East to the Byzantine border when they could. I include inter alia the Pechenegs and the Cumans. My humble self and Professor Arabadzis tried to focus on the questions rather than the answer, viewing the Mediterranean as a large puzzle of people, merchandise, and interests, which cannot be explained without the inner Asia element and without the cooperation of the academic scholars of both sides, East and West. Bringing up the religious factor, our paper was harmoniously accompanied by the presentation of Professor Ioannis Panagiotopoulos about the Nestorians in the Sasanian Empire and the affairs of Romans and Persians regarding them during the 6th century, but not only. Professor Lijuan also provided today very interesting notes about the Syriac version of the legend of St. George found in Turfan. I regard it as another block of testimonies about the significant presence of the Syriac element in northwestern China, connected to strengthening the Byzanto-Chinese relations in the region. I must add here the PhD student in situ, because we tend to speak mainly about the Silk Road, but we have a lot to discuss about Chinese inventions and innovations too, such as paper. I was almost hearing the 12th century poet Ioannis arguing and complaining about not having paper in Constantinople to write down. This was a very good one. The most significant 13th century, when everything changed and everything seemed to be possible in an extended region from Mediterranean to Eastern medieval China, was put into new light by Professor Ilias Giarenis. But then there was already a shadow coming at the front. I think David Graff has called it most accurately as the shadow of the steppes, I mean the Turks. The paper about Michael Psellos and China, delivered by the historian and dear friend, Frederick Lauritzen, shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, since this 11th century Byzantine personality was in the forefront pretty much in every occasion. Well, of course, the outcome is again how in these two culturally distinct but historically resonant imperial societies, how both cultures, that is, were specifically linked to new ways of understanding each other and conducted businesses and politics. And I cannot think anything more suitable as a closure than the future. Professor Emeritus Michael Kordosis gave us moments before a roadmap Portolano, of the areas of research and future prospects. Not wishing to hold you any longer, I rest my case, as they say, being sure that an academic step was done today, and hoping that this step will mark the beginning for many to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katerina. In my part, I have the honor to close the works of the International Conference by thanking each and every one of you for the participation. Special thank you all to the helping staff of the conference, and especially Dr. Dimitrios Vachaviolos, who is also our guide to the old castle city of Mistras. We are looking forward to collaborating in the scientific fields emergent from this discussion. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you also the Professor Cheng from the Peking. Okay, thank you very much.